The small town looked half asleep under the fading winter light. The roads were a mess of melted snow and old grime, mixing into a murky slush that splattered anything unlucky enough to pass. Cars rolled by, each one coated in the same stained layer of winter filth, heading toward warm houses Arthur could only imagine. A young teen stood at the side of the road, staring up at the dark sky swallowed by clouds. It would start snowing again soon. He sighed a long, heavy breath that felt too old for someone his age. He turned and began walking. Short black hair, sharp blue eyes, the kind of face that could have passed for a model if not for the clear signs of hunger etched into his features. 17 years. That was how long he'd been here. 17 years since his old world slipped out of reach forever. The walk was long, long enough for minutes to blur into hours. When he finally reached the edge of town, a worn-down house waited for him. Half of it looked abandoned. The other half looked like it should be. The door didn't even have a lock. A loud creak broke the silence as he pushed it open. Inside was nothing more than a small bed in a cramped living room. A stove sat to the right with a pile of chopped logs beside it. That was his heating, his kitchen, and sometimes his only comfort. He dropped his backpack, fed the stove a few logs, tucked a scrap of newspaper underneath, and spent a full minute forcing the flame to catch. When it finally did, warmth began to seep into the room. Another sigh drifted from his mouth, forming a thin cloud in the cold air. He lay down on the bed, pulled out a notebook and a pen, and flipped to the first page. Name: Arthur Moriarty. His current name. Below it, written smaller, was the name he never used anymore. Name: John A. Ross. He brushed his fingers over it, felt the familiar sting in his chest, and closed the page before it grew stronger. He turned to a fresh sheet and wrote down the events of his day. I woke up. I went to school. I came back home. That was it. His routine. His life. Harder than before, but still a life. He starved himself more often than not just to make it through school. He ignored the whispers, the side glances, the ugly things people thought he couldn't hear. Even so, a small voice in him stayed steady. It's still a good life. I have a roof. I can cook warm meals. It's just rougher than what I was used to. He set the notebook down and pulled out his textbooks next. English, chemistry, physics, mathematics, Spanish, biology, geography, astronomy. He read each one, revisiting the same lines he already knew by heart. There was nothing else to do, and getting sick was the last thing he could risk. Wasting energy was just as dangerous. Study, study, study. That had become his rhythm. He didn't even enjoy it. He liked reading, sure, but not this kind. Science books felt dry and lifeless. He'd always preferred mythology, fantasy, anything that hinted at the supernatural. Midnight slipped in quietly. He set the astronomy book aside, curled up under the thin blanket, and shut his eyes. The fire was out, but the room still held enough warmth for now. Good night. Sleep came fast, pulling him away from the thoughts that never seemed to stop. Hours passed. Moonlight faded. The sun crawled up over the horizon. At 7 in the morning, Arthur woke with a tremor running through his entire body. The cold had crept in again. Shivering, he stumbled to the stove and worked the fire back to life. It was meant for cooking, but he'd been using it as a heater for months. I'll have to go hunting again soon, he thought, stuffing his books back into his bag. Hunger didn't wait for anyone. The kitchen was a ruin, but he still checked the fridge. Inside, wrapped in a brown cloth, was the last of what he'd managed to catch. A snow rabbit. He placed the meat over the stove. This is the last one, he thought. Another quiet sigh slipped out. Just how long had it been since he'd eaten a real meal? Arthur couldn't even remember. Watching the meat sizzle on the stove, a small smile tugged at his lips. Eating meat in my own house. Honestly, what more could I ask for? It was funny. In his previous life, owning a home had been a dream he never expected to reach. Now he was living in a place that was barely standing, scraping by day after day, yet it was still his. That alone felt like an achievement. He used the iron fork he kept beside the stove and flipped the meat once the edges browned. Minutes later, it was done. He moved it onto the one clean plate he owned. He didn't risk using it for anything but meat. If winter drags on any longer, I'm going to be in trouble, he thought as he took the first bite. Delicious, he murmured, warmth spreading through his chest. He finished the meal in minutes. Stepping outside, he scooped a handful of snow, using it to scrub the plate clean before heading back inside. The dish and fork went back beside the stove to dry. He grabbed his backpack. He was already dressed for school. He'd slept in his clothes again. He didn't own anything warmer anyway. He cleared the stove, setting the charred wood aside. Even that was worth saving. Once everything was in order, he stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him. Snow drifted down from the sky. Figures, he thought, remembering last night's forecast of heavy clouds. The cold cut through his clothes at first, but as he walked, his body adjusted. The warmth came quickly, almost unnaturally so. This body is strange, he thought, watching his breath fade. If I were still in my old body, I'd never survive on so little food. And the cold? Forget it. Sometimes it feels like this body isn't even fully human. He pushed the thought aside. The school gate was already in sight. Forts High School. Arthur glanced at the plaque, then headed in. Students filled the hallways, rushing between classes. Yo, Arthur! He turned. Jacob waved at him, flanked by his usual crew, who always looked more like backup dancers than actual friends. What's up? Arthur asked. Want to hang out later? We found this abandoned place yesterday. Abandoned place? He echoed. His mind flicked to his own living situation. No one at school knew how he lived, and he intended to keep it that way. Teenagers could be cruel. He couldn't afford to get into fights, couldn't risk drawing attention. So he showered at school every other day, took care of his clothes, and stayed aware of every trend just to blend in. Sure, I'll check it out, Arthur said with a quick wave before walking off. All right, see you after school. Jacob called back. Arthur didn't look back. Moments later, he reached biology and slipped inside, taking his usual seat. Back straight, eyes forward, posture calm. The perfect student, at least on the outside. One more year. Keep the grades up, get a scholarship, and things will finally start moving forward. The door opened, but it wasn't the professor. A girl with long brown hair walked in, pale-skinned and soft-featured. Beside her was a young man whose beauty was almost unreal, his skin so pale it bordered on corpse-like. Arthur stared. Why did they look familiar? It wasn't the first time he'd asked himself that. Every time he saw them, something tugged at the edge of his memory. Something from before Forks. A feeling, a name, a face, something he could almost remember but couldn't reach. And every time he tried, his head started to hurt. He shook the thought away. If they were important, I'd remember. The door opened again. This time, the professor entered carrying a stack of papers. As I mentioned last week, we're having the exam today. I hope everyone prepared. He began handing out the sheets. All right, Arthur thought, straightening in his seat. Let's get this done.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to FanFic Canon. Thanks for hitting play. I'm thrilled to bring this fan-made story to life for you. If you enjoy the ride and want more narrated fanfics, smash, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. And if you want audiobook of a novel of your choice, join my Patreon. Request any title that's freely available online, and I'll produce a full narration just for you. Now, let's dive into today's adventure.
Looking at the exam paper before him, Arthur was calm. He knew every single answer. He already knew the entire book the exam was based on word for word after all. Taking the cap off his blue pen, Arthur started filling up the exam sheet. It didn't take him more than a few minutes to complete it and place the cap back on his pen. I'm done, Professor, Arthur said as he got up from his seat and handed the paper to the man before asking, Could I go out? Sure, Arthur. The man replied with a light smile as he took Arthur's completed paper. Thank you, Arthur replied before turning around, grabbing his backpack, and heading out of the classroom. The professors were already used to Arthur. He always completed the exams first before everyone else, and then left the classroom. At first, the professor had been worried that he would be out and causing trouble. However, after the first few times, they were relieved to see that he only went out to the library to read books. He was, in a word, the joy of the professors. Outside the classroom, Arthur immediately started heading toward the school library. It was a place where he could rest, as well as enjoy books that he otherwise couldn't buy. Most kids these days either watch TV or spend their time playing video games. Arthur had no access to things like that, and so he had found some solace in the stories that were written in the books. Arriving in front of the library doors, Arthur pushed them open before heading inside. Looking around, he found a single person sitting at the table. A short woman with dark brown hair and amber eyes that resembled jewels of gold. Her lips curled slightly upwards as she looked at Arthur. Why is she looking at me? Arthur wondered to himself before giving the woman a light nod of his head and turning around to walk toward the bookshelf on the right side of the room. Looking at the numerous book covers, Arthur wondered what he should read this time. He had almost read every single book in the room, more than 600 of them during the close to 2 years that he had been in the school. Twilight Wings. I haven't read this one yet, Arthur thought as he raised his hand to take the book out of the shelf. It was at this moment that the realization hit him. It was fast, like an electric shock passing through his entire nervous system. Twilight, Twilight. This name kept repeating in his mind over and over until his previous poker face changed into a downcast one. I'm inside a book, Arthur thought to himself, his emotions a complete mess on the inside as his hand, which was holding the back of the Twilight Wings book, shook, causing a rattling noise as the book kept hitting the wooden shelf. Are you all right? A calm feminine voice said from behind him. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you for asking, Arthur replied, his voice appearing just as calm as always. Calm down, this really isn't the time. Arthur thought to himself before taking the Twilight Wings book completely out of the shelf and holding it in his hands. Taking a deep breath and releasing it softly, Arthur turned around and walked to the table in the middle of the library. Making sure to keep his eyes down, Arthur sat down on the opposite side of the woman and opened the book, starting to read its prologue. What's the book about? Lifting his gaze, he looked at the girl once more. Her eyes looked to be filled with joy as she gazed at him, her curled lips only accentuating this thought of Arthur's. I don't know really. I just started reading it for the first time, Arthur replied before lowering his gaze once more. I see. Actually, I was going to read that as well. Do you mind if we read it together? Lifting his gaze once more, Arthur said nothing in reply besides giving a small nod of his head. Thanks, the girl replied enthusiastically. With the sound of the chair scraping the floor, the girl stood up, came around the table, and sat next to Arthur. Arthur moved the book closer to the girl whilst releasing an inward sigh. Why is it that this shit always happens to me? I just found out that I'm inside a book, and now one of the book's main characters is sitting next to me. Arthur thought to himself, his focus completely drawn out of the book before he felt a slight touch on his right arm. Are you done reading the first page? Yeah, Arthur replied before turning the page. Minutes passed with the only sound in the school library being the flipping of book pages. Ring. With a loud noise, the bell rang announcing the end of the first period. With a quick motion, Arthur quickly got up from the table before turning towards the girl. I have to get to the next class. Me too. What's your name, by the way? Mine's Alice Cullen. Arthur Moriarty. Nice to meet you, Arthur said as he extended his hand for a handshake. Giggle. You're so old-fashioned, Alice said as she took Arthur's hand and shook it. Cold, Arthur thought before nodding his head, his expression unchanging as he turned around and headed out of the library. A moment later, his figure vanished behind the closing doors. So cold. Am I ugly? Alice mumbled to herself, only to hear a reply the next moment as the library doors opened once more. No, it was a tall man with the same eyes as Alice, though they appeared darker, more sinister somehow, with curly blonde hair and light freckles on his face. The man was unimaginably handsome. Jasper, what are you doing here? Coming to get you, of course. We're heading out early today. Edward said he had something to show us. Time passed slowly until the last ring of the school bell signaled the end of classes. Walking out of the astronomy classroom, Arthur made his way through the school halls and arrived outside, where he was met by 3 teenage boys. Hey, Jacob. Raising his hand, Arthur said with a wave. Yo, Arthur, let's go check that shit out. I can barely wait. People even say that a ghost lives at that abandoned house. Jacob said with a grin on his face. Yeah, I doubt it, Arthur replied as he joined the group. The 4 boys walked out of the school, turned right, and continued down the road. This is in the direction of my house. Arthur thought before releasing an inward sigh. He, however, didn't make any outward changes to his expression, maintaining that poker face of his. Soon enough, the four of them arrived at the so-called haunted house. Standing still in front of it, the three teens around Arthur started talking excitedly. "Yo, this shit looks exactly like a haunted house." The one on the right said as he scratched his left arm, a clear sign that he was slightly distressed about entering the house. "Yeah, let's head in, or are you wussing out?" Jacob said with a grin on his face as he turned to face Arthur and the two boys. "Hell no, I'm not a wuss," the one on Arthur's right side replied before confidently walking toward the house. Jacob immediately followed him, and a moment later, the boy on Arthur's left side also started following them from behind. Arthur, meanwhile, stood still for a moment longer. "It is my house." Sigh. Starting to walk after the teens, Arthur's mind was in slight disarray. What do I do now? Arthur thought as he saw the boys push his front door open. I can't tell them that this is where I live. These guys act friendly with me because I'm the famous Arthur, the genius of the school. If they could, they would betray me without a second thought and spread all kinds of rumors around the entire school. Arthur thought as he and the three of them headed inside his house. I think someone lives in here, guys, Jacob said as he came to the living room next to the bed that Arthur had used to sleep in for the last few years of his life. Yeah, look, there's even clean dishes here. The other said as he walked to the stove that Arthur had used just this morning to cook his breakfast. I think we should head out, Arthur finally said. The three turned towards him. Raising his eyebrow, Jacob asked, "Why scared?" "No, it's just that if this is really someone's house, then we are basically entering into their house without permission," Arthur said before releasing a sigh and turning around. "Yeah, let's get out of here, Jacob." Fine, Jacob finally said after a moment of silence. The four teens walked outside of the house before Arthur raised his hand and gave him a wave. "Well, that sure was disappointing. I'm heading home. See you all next week," Arthur said before starting to walk away. "Yeah, see you later, Arthur," the three teens said before they walked off in the other direction. Minutes passed by before a figure was seen approaching the haunted-looking house again. It was Arthur. Walking inside the house, he quickly closed the door and headed into the living room. It's good the door was open, or those bastards would have broken a window to get in. It's already cold enough in here, Arthur thought as he placed his backpack next to the bed. Turning around, he headed to the kitchen where he took what looked like a primitive spear and bow with two handmade arrows. It's time to go hunting, Arthur thought as he headed to the back of the living room where another door stood. It led to the forest behind the house. Walking outside, Arthur headed into the forest. As soon as he did, so his entire presence changed. The sounds of a city behind him died down in his ears, whilst the sound of rustling leaves and insects seemed to intensify tenfold. His steps, which could be heard until then, turned dead silent. His figure hunched slightly, mimicking the image of a prowling predator as he scoured the forest for his prey. Sniff, sniff. His nostrils flared as he took in the scents around him. A couple of rabbits and a wolf. A deer as well, though it was farther away. Arthur thought as he entered deeper and deeper into the forest. Rustle. Hearing the sound of bushes rustling, Arthur immediately turned his gaze to the right. Around 50 meters away, Arthur thought before starting to walk closer slowly. By the sounds, it's likely a rabbit. The closer he got, the more he could hear the sounds and smell the scents before he finally confirmed his guess. There, 15 meters away from his location, next to a large pine tree, stood a small snow rabbit. It's my lucky day. They're usually harder to find, Arthur thought as he slowly and carefully took his bow that he had tied to his back and one arrow tied around his waist. Pulling the string of the bow carefully, his eyes glued to his prey, Arthur took a deep breath. His arms remained steady as stone for a moment before finally releasing the string. FSHH. With a low sound of something piercing the air, the arrow drew a clean arch and pierced straight through the rabbit's head. His precision was astounding. Nice, Arthur thought as he walked closer to his prey, took it in his hands, and turned around, heading back towards his house once more. A small rabbit like this would only last a normal human a day at most. However, Arthur had found that he could last an entire 3 days with just this small amount of meat without losing any muscle mass. This body feels just as weird as ever, though now that I know I'm inside a book, I guess it is easier to explain. Arthur thought to himself as he walked inside his house through the back door. Walking back home hadn't taken long with Arthur, not having to walk as quietly as before. As he walked, he felt like a headache was incoming. Do I just not interfere with the plot at all? Arthur asked himself. A moment later, he nodded his head. I don't want to be a vampire either way, or, as they call it, a cold one in this universe. Arthur thought his mind already made up when he walked to the kitchen. Plopping the dead rabbit onto the counter, he took a knife, the only one that he had, and started skinning the prey. His hands moved with precision and experience. He had been living like this for years. The father of this body died in a car crash, whilst the mother disappeared without a word 3 years ago. Arthur thought as he took the skinned rabbit and hung it upside down whilst placing a bowl underneath it. This should be done in a few hours. Arthur thought before turning around and walking back toward his living room. Bella Swan still hasn't arrived in Forks. It should only be around a month or 2 now before she arrives. With her arrival, the plot of the Twilight series begins. Thankfully, she wasn't someone who socialized with everyone. In fact, it might even be better for me, Arthur thought as he laid down on his bed and took out his physics book, opening the first page. With Bella here, most of the students at school will turn their attention toward the new student and leave me alone for a while. Hours passed by, and soon it was midnight. Getting up from his bed, Arthur walked to the kitchen where he took the skinned rabbit and started chopping it apart piece by piece. Taking a single leg to eat, he bundled up the rest in his brown cloth that he had already washed and placed it in the fridge. It wasn't that the fridge helped in keeping the food fresh, however, it was quite well isolated from the world and didn't allow for insects to get in. Thankfully, it was wintertime, and with how cold the weather was in Forks, the food naturally maintained a decent condition for longer than during the summer. Taking the leg with him, Arthur turned around and headed to the stove where he started cooking it. Eating it later and sleeping soon after, the day fully passed, and soon the sun showed up over the horizon once more, signaling the start of a new day. It's Saturday. I should head into the forest to grab some more firewood, as well as to see if I can hunt anything else. Arthur thought as he grabbed his hunting tools, as well as an axe which he had stolen a few years back. As he was heading towards the back door, Arthur heard a noise from the front of his house. Is this it? Yeah, we were here yesterday, but Arthur thought that someone was living here, so we went back. Yeah, as if someone could live in here. Let's check if the fire was started or if there are any changes if there then someone lives in here and we get out. If not, then we can make this our smoking place. Those fuckers. Arthur thought in frustration. He rarely got angry, however, when it came to the only place that he could actually relax in, a place that was quite precious to the current him. He could not get angry at people who were looking to practically usurp it. Well, all right then, Arthur said as he walked toward his kitchen with quick steps. Taking several rusted and unused pans, he quickly started smashing them together. Tang, tang, clang. Loud noises were immediately made from the pans hitting each other forcefully. What is that? Do you hear that, Jacob? Yeah, shit. It looks like someone does live here. The voice, now identified as Jacob, said before Arthur heard 2 pairs of footsteps walking away. Fuckers, Arthur thought before putting the rusted broken pans down. Sigh. Releasing another long-winded sigh, he turned around and walked toward the back door once more. Arriving outside, he walked toward the forest at a quick pace, afraid that someone might still be around and see him heading out of the broken-down house. As he walked through the forest, making sure to keep his stealth whilst listening to any sound around him, Arthur heard something. Human. Those sound like human footsteps. Arthur thought to himself instantly as soon as he heard the sound. What's someone doing inside the forest this early in the morning? What were they even doing in the forest in the first place? Arthur questioned, however, he couldn't come up with an answer. No, he could. It was just that the answer he came to wasn't even slightly pleasing. It could be a cold one or a shapeshifter from the Quileute. Arthur thought before turning around slowly and starting to head in the opposite direction of the sound. Arthur, a voice said from behind him. I didn't even hear them. Arthur thought immediately as he turned around quickly to look in the direction of the voice that had said his name. There, Tens of meters away stood a small woman with a pixie haircut wearing thick clothes suited for the winter weather. Next to her was another man wearing similar clothes. He had blonde, curly hair with amber-like eyes, just like the woman next to him. "Alice," Arthur replied as he straightened himself up and looked toward the woman. "Yeah, didn't expect to see you out here in the forest," Alice said with a small smile as she started walking towards him, the man following behind her. "Yeah, I didn't expect to meet you here either," Arthur replied, his voice sounding dull as he gazed at the two figures walking closer and closer to him. "Ah, this is Jasper, my brother," Alice said as she arrived a few feet away from Arthur. "Right, nice to meet you, Jasper." "The pleasure is mine," Jasper replied with a clear southern accent. His expression was calm, though it still looked like he was slightly in pain, or rather it looked more like he was uncomfortable. "So what are you guys doing out here?" Arthur asked, his tone, as always, dull, almost emotionless, if not for the fact that his voice was slightly higher pitched than usual. "We just like taking long walks in the forest. It's calming, you know." Alice set her pitch high as she explained to Arthur excitedly. "Right?" Arthur said as he gave the two a look over. They did look like they had worn clothes suited for walking through the cold forest during the winter. Not like they need them. "So what about you? What brings you so deep in the forest?" Alice questioned as she got closer to Arthur. "I like hunting. Was looking to see if I can find any rabbits or deer," Arthur replied as he motioned to the bow and arrows on his back with his head. Alice's eyes seemed to slightly shine at this as she nodded her head. "That's so cool, but be careful so that people don't see you. It's not hunting season, you know. You could get in serious trouble," Alice replied as she held up her index finger and shook it left and right as if she were a mother chiding her problem child. "Right. Well, unless you two out me, then I think I'll be safe," Arthur replied before releasing a small chuckle. It sounded horribly fake, completely forced, and all three of them could tell. A small smile graced Jasper's face as he lightly shook his head. "All right, we have to get going, Alice. It was nice meeting you, Arthur. Looks like the rumors are true," Jasper said as he turned around. "Rumors?" Arthur questioned before the man could fully turn around. "They say you're the nicest guy ever. I mean, we met in the middle of a forest, and you still greeted us and talked with us so politely. Though I do have to say that it's quite dumb," Alice said before releasing a small giggle at the end of her words. "I already met you at the library. You didn't seem like a bad person." Whilst he replied outwardly, inwardly he thought differently. "Even if I wanted to, how was I supposed to run from a vampire? If I knew beforehand, then maybe I could hide my scent, but you two appeared so suddenly that I had no time to prepare at all. Right? I'm just saying you should be more careful in the future. You don't know what kind of people you could meet in the middle of the forest. Right, Jasper?" Alice said before turning her head toward her brother. "Right. Well then, goodbye, Arthur. See you later." "Right. Goodbye, Alice, Jasper," Arthur said as he turned around and started walking away from the two. After around a minute of walking in a random direction, Arthur turned his head to look back and saw nothing but the lone trees of the forest. Sigh. I've already met her twice in just 2 days when I didn't have any interaction with her before yesterday. Her, or any of the other Cullens for that matter. Arthur thought as he continued his search for his next prey. His steps grew silent whilst his figure became slightly hunched. Minutes passed by, and right before the right hand of the small watch in his hand touched the next hour, Arthur finally returned back to his old, abandoned-looking house. Placing his catch, 2 small snow rabbits in the freezer, he took the rest of his previous catch and chopped off another leg. Eating 2 days in a row. It's been a while, Arthur thought as a small soft smile appeared on his expression. Walking toward the stove, he placed a rabbit leg on it before crouching down and grabbing a few half-charred logs before placing them inside the stove and using a lighter and a piece of newspaper, lighting them on fire. Good, it already caught fire, Arthur thought as he waited until the stove was burning hot and then started rotating the rabbit leg so that it would be equally roasted on all sides. After a few minutes of roasting the leg, Arthur took it out of the fire and bit into it. It's as bland as always. He thought, however, his mouth didn't stop, continuing to bite into the slightly burnt meat. It was gone in less than 10 bites. Sigh. Releasing a soft sigh, Arthur turned around and flung the rabbit leg bone, It flew in a perfect arc through the air before landing on a small trash can in the kitchen. If only this body of mine enhanced my brain as well. That way I could have found a way, somehow, to live better in this situation, but all I have is a strong body and senses. My intelligence is average. I have to read a book more than 30 times to actually manage to memorize it. Arthur thought as he headed back to his bed and lying down. Covering his body with a slim blanket, he closed his eyes. He didn't have anything to do today, so he spent the entire day sleeping. Maybe it was because his body was almost always starving. Maybe it was because the body was weird in a way, superhuman as others would call it. However, Arthur could enter periods of hibernation. If he wanted to, he could sleep as long as he wanted to and wake exactly when he wanted to. At least it helps endure the hunger. Arthur thought to himself depreciatingly as his eyes snapped open. It was now Sunday, another day where he would have even less to do than yesterday. At least today, he wouldn't have to go out in the cold and hunt, as he already had enough meat for the week. Surviving on a small rabbit leg a day was doable for Arthur. That, however, didn't mean that it was easy. Far from it, in fact. The pangs of hunger were always there, a constant reminder of how his living situation. At least it's better when I'm at school, Arthur thought, walking toward the front of the house. Arthur first looked through the almost fully cracked window, checking to see if anyone was nearby. He had to be cautious of every single person in Forks. After all, the small population made it, so that rumors spread as fast as a forest fire. Clear, Arthur thought, before walking outside of the house and onto the streets. He was heading toward the local library. Let's see if it's that old hag or if it's that new employee, Arthur thought as he walked through the cold streets. The wind was cold and fast, hitting his face forcefully and ingraining the cold even further into his body, which was clothed in what could only barely be considered winter clothes. The snow wasn't doing him any favors either, as it had started melting once more today, and thus it had turned into a disgusting slush just like it had been on Friday. Around half an hour of walking later, Arthur finally arrived close to his destination. It was in downtown Forks. On his left side was a small grocery store, and further down the road stood the small library building. Arthur wouldn't be able to buy any books, however, that didn't mean that he couldn't borrow them. It was at this moment, as he was walking past the grocery store, that he heard someone call his name. "Arthur, is that you?" Hearing the now familiar voice call his name, Arthur turned around to face the store, and just as he had dreaded, there she was. Alice Cullen, in all her majestic glory, stood next to a silver Volvo. "Is she stalking me?" "No, she has no reason to do so. She already has a mate." Arthur thought as he gave the girl a nod, trying to move on as quickly as he could. Nothing good would come from talking with the Cullens. It would at best be a neutral conversation, and at worst it would cause immense trouble for a human like Arthur. Seeing the girl start walking toward him instantly, Arthur stopped himself from turning around and walking away right that instant. Why am I even staying here and having a conversation with her when I could just ignore her altogether? Arthur thought, confused at his own choices. However, it was already too late. Alice was standing before him, and right behind her was a tall man with short brown hair and dark amber eyes. Edward Cullen, Arthur thought, before completely focusing on Alice. "We've been meeting so much these days," Alice said as her lips curled up into a smile, her face seeming to almost radiate as she looked at Arthur. "Yeah. Anyway, it was nice meeting you again, Alice. I'm heading to the library to steal some books," Arthur said as he gave her and Edward a nod of his head. For a moment, the two Cullens seemed to freeze as they processed what Arthur had just said. What book should I steal?" Arthur thought as he walked further and further away from the two vampires. Did he just say steal? Or are my ears not working correctly, Edward? Alice murmured as she stared at Arthur's back whilst he got further and further away. "No, he's even thinking about what book to steal right now," Edward replied as he similarly stood still whilst gazing at Arthur's disappearing figure. "Wow, I know I like to joke around sometimes and do some light pranks, but he's actually going stealing and talking about it, as if it's his usual Sunday activity," Alice murmured once more, her tone clearly showing how confused she was at the situation. "I knew you were different, but first hunting in the middle of the forest in the winter outside of hunting season, and now telling both me and my brother that you're going to steal?" Alice thought before lightly shaking her head. He goes hunting in the forest? Edward questioned as he turned around, starting to walk back toward the silver Volvo. Alice followed him a split moment later. Yeah, Jasper and I found him in the forest behind the abandoned house. You know, the one that people are calling haunted these days, Alice replied, nodding her head quickly as she practically skipped her way to the Volvo. He's quite the interesting guy, I'll give him that much, Edward said before hopping into the silver Volvo. I think we got everything Esme asked for, right? Did we get the right cookbook? Alice asked as she hopped into the front passenger seat. Yeah, this should be it, Edward said before turning the ignition key. Meanwhile, at the end of the street, inside the small library building, Arthur was walking through rows of bookshelves that went up to the ceiling and were brimming with all kinds of books. Be it science and history or science fiction and mythology. Maybe some mythology book? Considering that I know for sure that mythological creatures exist in this world, then maybe I'll be able to find some information about them. Arthur thought as he headed to the mythological section of the library. This section seemed to be quite smaller than the others. In fact, it was only about 1/4 the size of the others and 1/10 the size of the romance section. That old hag sure likes romance, doesn't she? Arthur thought as he lifted his eyes from the books in front of him and turned his gaze towards the counter, behind which an old woman appearing to be older than 70 by Arthur's estimate sat. Even now, the old woman was reading a romance novel. Sigh. Releasing a soft sigh that was unheard from the woman, Arthur turned his gaze away. If only she had good taste in romance. If only... Arthur thought as the disturbing image appeared in his mind. It was an image that had been ingrained in his mind since the day that he had decided to see what the woman would recommend him to read. Looking through the mythology books, Arthur quickly found something that piqued his interest. It was a brown hardcover book. On its back, the title was inscribed in red. The Real Myths. Compared to the other books, this title was the only one that insinuated that the mythological creatures were real. Arthur didn't have much hope for it, as he knew it could simply be a title made to captivate the reader's curiosity and nothing more. Either way, deciding that he would give it a try, Arthur quickly took the book and hid it under his clothes before using his belt to firmly press it against his body so that it would be less noticeable that he was hiding a book. Turning around, Arthur started walking towards the exit, merely lifting his hand as he passed by the old woman behind the counter. Given his good reputation, she had never once thought that Arthur would be stealing a book. I'm heading out. I'll be back in a few days to see if something new comes, ma'am, Arthur said as he gave her a wave of his hand whilst he headed to the door. All right. See you next time, Arthur. Have a nice day, the woman replied, still not even lifting her head from the book she was reading. Yeah. Have a nice day, Arthur said before opening the front door and heading outside. As easy as always. Arthur thought he had been stealing books like this for months, and as long as he returned them before the last Friday of the month, where the woman would count to see if all the books were in their right places and check who was borrowing books and were late on their returns, then Arthur would never be found. Walking through the snow-packed streets, Arthur headed back toward his house. He arrived there later, only to lie on his bed once again and start reading the book he had stolen. The Real Myths. Let's check this out, Arthur thought to himself as he flipped to the first page of the book. He had developed a habit of talking to himself recently, though he didn't mind it. It was a way that made him feel like he wasn't as alone. This book describes sightings of mythological creatures that have been seen in the real world. All right, Arthur thought before flipping the page. The title of the very next page was called Vampires. Vampires are a widely known mythological species. They have been sighted in multiple regions of this world. The easiest way to tell a vampire is by their red feline eyes and their large fangs. It's a fake. Arthur immediately determined, however, he continued reading the book. Even if the information was fake and didn't really hold anything about real vampires, it was still a book he hadn't read before, and so he could use it to pass the time. Hours passed by as Arthur continued reading. It was only when the night approached and the moon reached its highest position did Arthur plop the book down, finishing it completely. A good enough read, I suppose, Arthur thought before turning around on his side and closing his eyes, falling asleep almost instantly. It was at this moment that a shadow covered Arthur's face, blocking the lighting from the lit stove on his right. "Arthur," Alice thought as she looked at his sleeping figure. It was a shock, to say the least. She hadn't expected this. "You've been living here? Alone?" Alice thought to herself as she started walking through the house. "So that's why you were out hunting in the forest," Alice thought as her face scrunched up in frustration. "Whilst I was taking my time and figuring out a way to meet you properly, whilst I was afraid that you would be weirded out by me, you were living like this." Her face scrunched up even further. However, no tears came out of her eyes. She couldn't shed them after all. No matter how emotional she got, no matter how much she wanted to cry, she simply couldn't. All that was left was this feeling of suffocation, a feeling of loss so overbearing that it almost caused her to drop to her knees. "I'm sorry, Arthur. I really didn't know," Alice thought before turning around, and, similarly to a shadow, she disappeared from the abandoned house, as if she had never been there at all. Hours later, Arthur's eyes snapped open. It was the early morning hours, an hour before he had to get to school. Turning around, he got up from the bed and headed to the stove, igniting the fire that had stopped burning sometime last night. Then, he headed to the kitchen to take out another piece of rabbit meat. Roasting the rabbit meat for a few minutes, Arthur quickly dug into it as soon as it was ready, finishing his small meal in a few short minutes. "All right, I'll have to wash my clothes at school today," Arthur thought as he changed out of his current clothes that he had worn for a few days now and switched into his second set. He only had these 2 pairs of clothes, so he had to rotate between them every few days, washing a pair whilst he wore the other. He had thought of stealing clothes, however, every shop in Forks that sold clothes had cameras everywhere, and he would most likely get caught in the act, which would be a hassle he didn't want to deal with. Wearing his new clothes, Arthur placed the other pair into his backpack after folding them carefully. Turning toward the lit stove, he quickly killed the fire so that he would save some of the charred wood for when he came back from school. With that done, he headed outside of the house and toward Forks High School. "I hate washing day," Arthur thought as he walked. He would always get stressed that someone would find out. However, he hadn't been found a single time yet, so it was less stressful than the first time he had done it. The walk to the school didn't take long, and soon enough Arthur could see the front gates of Forks High School. Looking at the high schoolers with backpacks on their backs heading inside the school grounds, Arthur felt envy. He never delved deep into these emotions, always thinking that he should love what he has and not envy others for their things. However, Arthur was still human. He still had times where he would feel jealous of what others had that he didn't. He, however, didn't let these emotions control him, be it anger, envy, or hate. Instead, he used them all as fuel. Anger at having to live in this shitty world, anger at having to deal with supernaturals who could sever his life in an instant. Envy of others who did nothing yet lived their lives so much better than he did. And lastly, hate at the fact that even in this second lease on life that he got, he still was treated as nothing but trash by those who gave birth to him. Hate at his birth mother who had abandoned him. It doesn't matter. In the end, hard work always pays off. I may be worse off now, but I will be much higher than everyone else in the end. Arthur thought as he felt his motivation to reach even higher in this social organism that humans had created. People said that money wasn't everything and that people shouldn't be materialistic. However, the only people who had such thoughts were those who had money. It was only the people with a good roof on their heads and as much food as they needed on their tables. Heading inside the school and walking through the hallways, Arthur quickly arrived at his first classroom. Walking inside, he saw that he was a bit early and that the entire class was there yet. The teacher was probably still in the teacher's staff room. "Guess I'll read some more," Arthur thought as he opened the chemistry book and read the last topic they had learned during the previous class. Minutes passed by, and soon the teacher came inside, and the lesson started fully. During his past life, Arthur had never lifted his hand and answered the professor's questions. He had thought that only losers did so, and that his so-called friends would judge him as some kind of nerd, only to later realize that when he grew up and that when he entered the real world, those so-called friends would just move on. He remembered vividly how he had texted, had called them to go out and drink a simple coffee, do anything together, and all he had received had been fake yes. After a time, they hadn't even answered his texts or calls, Some had even straight up blocked him. Everyone else's opinions don't matter. Will they be there when I'm in need of money? Will they be there when I have to stay and do extracurricular lessons? No, of course they won't be there. Arthur thought to himself before he released a chuckle, causing the other students around him to turn and look at him. Arthur never showed a real smile or chuckled. He was the so-called handsome, mysterious boy at school. I'm getting in my feelings today. Am I sick? Arthur thought before his mind wandered back to his previous thoughts once more. I don't hate them or judge them, though. That's just how life goes. People outgrow the friends who can't keep up with them. It was my fault for basing my entire personality on being the funny guy in class who didn't learn. Arthur, though, I was the dumb one. Hours passed, each class ending and with a short 5-minute break in between before the next class started. After 3 hours, the bell rang once more. It was time for a lunch break. The students got up from their seats as they joyously got together with their friends and classmates and headed to the cafeteria. Arthur headed there alone. He could have waited for Jacob and the rest, and he did sometimes, but today he most certainly wasn't in the mood to play friends with anyone. Walking through the halls with a book in his hand, Arthur kept reading as he carefully walked past the crowd. It was a skill he had developed. He was actually quite proud of it. Being able to read whilst avoiding the incoming traffic of students who were on lunch break. Arriving at the cafeteria, he quickly headed inside before directly heading to one of the tables and plopping his book down. Sometimes he would get someone to pay for him, or he would steal some change and buy some food at the cafeteria. However, that was only on rare occasions where he hadn't managed to get any successful hunts for a while. The school cafeteria only served food for free to those in poverty, and considering Arthur wanted to keep this image of the perfect student, he never showed that he was poor. Even if he did, he wouldn't be able to get the food from the cafeteria. He would instead be ousted as a homeless person and would be taken into government centers for adoption almost immediately. That was certainly not something he wanted for himself. Flipping through the book pages, Arthur's concentration allowed him to ignore the loud noises around him. However, he still noticed when these loud noises coming from the students chattering loudly with each other stopped. Lifting his head from his book, Arthur already knew the reason even without seeing it. There at the doors were the Cullens. Immediately whispers started all around as the students tried to look at them discreetly. Failing completely in the process, even Arthur could hear what they were saying, and if he could then the vampires most certainly could as well, and much more clearly than him at that too. First was Edward Cullen, then it was Emmett Cullen. Rosalie Hale was third, Jasper Hale was fourth, and finally through the doors and into the classroom came the last Cullen, Alice Cullen, who looked to be heading directly towards Arthur. Sigh, what does she want now? Arthur saw Alice Cullen turn her head towards him almost as soon as she came into the cafeteria, and then a moment later start walking toward him. What does she want from me now? Arthur thought almost immediately. He made sure to keep his thoughts clean. Thankfully, he had the ability to not think about certain things when he wanted to. That was a lifesaver when there was a vampire telepath around. Step, step, step. It didn't take more than a few seconds for Alice to arrive in front of him. Hello, Arthur, Alice said with an excited tone as she waved her hand at Arthur. Hello, Arthur replied, his tone much more dull as he looked at her for a brief moment. And then it was silence as Alice just stared at Arthur, clearly expecting him to ask her a question. She wanted to ask her why she's talking to me, isn't she? Arthur thought before releasing a sigh inwardly. So why are you here, Alice? Arthur questioned, deciding to get this over with as Alice clearly wasn't going to talk until he asked her. I'm glad you asked, so I wanted to invite you to our table, Alice said as she motioned toward a table at the end of the cafeteria where the Cullens were sitting. Turning his head to gaze at them, Arthur saw Emmett, the large vampire, give him a huge wave whilst he had a shit-eating grin on his face. Turning his head to face Alice once more, he shook his head. No thanks, I like being alone. Great. Oh, wait, what? Alice fumbled over her words as her eyes grew wide. Yeah, bye-bye, Alice, Arthur said before turning his head towards his book and continuing where he left off before the Cullens came into the cafeteria. Okay, see you later then, Arthur, Alice said after a few moments of simply staring at the boy in front of her. Turning around, she walked to the Cullen table where Emmett was waiting for her. This was the perfect time to joke about how she got rejected after all. "Emmett, if you say a word, I'm ripping your head off," Alice said before the boy could even open his mouth. Emmett simply raised his hand to his mouth and made a zipping motion as if he was closing his mouth. Sigh. Alice released a long-winded sigh as she turned her head to glance at Arthur. Minutes passed by, and soon enough the lunch break ended and the school bells rang, signaling the start of the classes once more. Getting up from his seat in the cafeteria, Arthur grabbed his book and headed outside of the hall and toward his next class. English, Arthur thought as he walked back toward his classroom. In the middle of the hall, just before he could arrive, Arthur had to stop as his eyes widened. "I forgot my backpack," Arthur thought as he quickly turned around and speed walked toward his physics classroom. Arriving there after around 2 minutes, Arthur found that classes had already started. Knock, knock. Knocking on the door, he quickly heard the professor calling him inside. "Hello, Professor. I forgot my backpack. Where could I get, please?" Arthur asked before receiving a quick yes. Nodding his head, Arthur gave a thanks politely before turning his head to look for his backpack. He quickly found it. It was in his next to where he had sat during the hour. In his seat, however, was Alice Cullen. "Is my luck trying to fuck with me today?" Arthur thought as he gave her a glance before lowering his eyes and simply walking to grab his backpack, deciding to simply ignore her and get out of the classroom. "I didn't let anyone touch it." Hearing her words, Arthur felt the need to release another sigh. Lifting his head, Arthur gave a quick nod. "Thanks, Alice," he said before grabbing the backpack and turning around before heading out of the classroom after giving the professor another thank you. Closing the door behind him, Arthur turned toward the other direction from where he had come from and started walking. "I probably won't even be allowed in the classroom since I'm late. Might just use this time to wash my clothes," Arthur thought as he headed towards the janitor cleaning room. Inside of it was a clothes washing machine, which rarely anyone used besides the janitor, and he only did once a month to clean his own uniform. Arriving in front of the room, Arthur quickly looked left and right to see if anyone was around before placing his ear on the door and checking to see if he could hear if anyone was inside. Hearing nothing and seeing no one around him, he quickly headed into the room and placed his clothes into the washing machine. 30 minutes. They will be done before the class hour is over, Arthur thought with a slight nod of his head as he pressed the button, and the washing machine started its process immediately. It caused a loud noise, however, considering that everyone was in the class or in the professor's staff room, no one would hear it. As for the janitor, he usually just hung around in the staff room, as well considering he could drink free tea in there. Lowering himself down, Arthur sat on the floor as he waited. As his thoughts wandered, he was interrupted by a voice. Skipping class. Arthur's eyes widened as he quickly raised his head to look at who it had been that had talked. It was Alice once more. Now I know for sure that she's stalking me, Arthur thought as he nodded his head. Yeah, I don't like English class, and I already learned everything that was in the textbook. It's just a waste of time to head in there, Arthur said, causing the girl to release a giggle as she looked at him. Right, and so you decided it was more productive to wash your clothes? Oh, fuck. Right, so you decided that it was more productive to wash your clothes? Alice asked with a small smirk on her face. Oh, fuck. Well, yeah, I dropped them this morning, and I'm going to go out tonight, so I need them washed and dried as quickly as possible, and I thought this was the best time to do it, Arthur replied with a small nod of his head before turning his attention toward the washing machine once more. Act normal. Act as if what I'm doing is completely normal, and she won't be suspicious at all, Arthur thought to himself before he saw someone appear in his vision. Alice had decided to climb up and sit on top of the washing machine. Couldn't you just leave the clothes at home so that they get washed? Alice asked as she raised an eyebrow. No, I'm going out right after school. What's it matter to you where I wash my clothes or what I do in the first place? Arthur questioned as he rose an eyebrow himself at the girl. Right, sorry. You could do whatever you want. I was just curious is all, Alice said before releasing a soft giggle. What's so funny? Nothing, I just always used to think that you were this perfect guy, the perfect student who always gets the best grades, always looks proper and everything. Guess you're human, Oswell. Almost thought you were a machine for a while. Yeah, I guess I'm only human, Arthur replied, whilst he looked at Alice in the eyes. Alice, why are you running so late? You know that Carlisle asked us to get out of school early today. A voice said from outside of the janitor room. All right, I almost forgot that I had something else to do. Alice mumbled to herself before she lifted herself and jumped down for the washing machine. Well, it was nice meeting you again. And just so you know, you're always welcome to come join us during lunch, Arthur. You don't have to sit alone. Alice said as she gave him a small wave before heading out of the room. Always welcome to join you. Join you in what? Endanger my life with that supernatural crap? No, thank you. Arthur thought to himself as he lowered his gaze and leaned down against the wall. Minutes passed, and after around half an hour, the clothes were done being fully washed and dried. Great, Arthur thought as he quickly took them out and placed them back inside his backpack before getting up from the floor and heading out of the room. It was only a few moments after he left that the school bells rang, signaling the end of the class. Time to head off to my next class now. With the washing done, I can finally relax for the day. Arthur thought as he started walking in the direction of the Spanish class. Spanish wasn't Arthur's forte. In fact, it was the class that he was the worst in. He just couldn't learn languages easily. It had been one of the hardest things for him to do so that he could keep up the image as the perfect student. However, if he wanted to get a 100% scholarship for university, then he had to do it. Hours passed, the classes ending one after another, and finally, the last class for the day was over. Slinging his backpack over his left shoulder, Arthur headed out of his classroom by himself and started walking through the halls of the school towards the exit. As he was walking through the halls, he felt someone come up from behind him and place a hand on his shoulder. Hey, Arthur, you want to come with us to Port Angeles today? We found this place where we can drink. Jacob, Arthur thought as he turned his head to face the teen. Drink? Are you sure you should be doing that, Jacob? If you get caught, your old man's going to give you quite the long lecture, just like last time. Arthur asked with a slight smirk on his face. Of course, it was fake. He didn't really enjoy Jacob's company, however, the boy did have his benefits. One of them being that he was what most would call the delinquent of the school. Practically no one dared to stare the young man in the eyes. Not even the professors. He was known as a problematic teen who would even dare beat up the teachers if they got on his nerves. The boy was 19 already, having failed 2 years in a row. However, it looked like he was going to be passing this year finally. The professors probably just want him out of their hands already. Arthur thought, don't worry about that. He won't ever find out like last time. I'm making sure to be extra careful, so what do you say? Jacob asked with a small chuckle whilst he had a grin on his expression. I don't have any money left. Can't really lie to get more either. Arthur said as he shook his head. Don't worry about that. I'll pay for you, man. Can't leave the homies behind just because of money. Meet us at the park downtown at 8 in the evening. See you there, Arthur. Jacob said as he patted Arthur's back before turning around and heading to another group of young boys. Arthur stood there still for a moment before continuing his walk towards the school's exit. Sigh. Releasing a soft sigh, Arthur had only one thought in his mind. What a damn drag. Arriving outside of the school, Arthur quickly walked outside of the school grounds and started heading toward his house. He would be going out with Jacob later tonight, so he wanted to at least get the homework done before he went there. He knew for a fact that he wouldn't be coming back to Forks until after midnight. Arriving in front of his abandoned-looking home, Arthur looked around before opening the front door after finding that no one was around or watching him. Closing the door behind him, Arthur headed into the living room, where he took out his clean set of clothes that he had washed and dried at school and quickly changed into them. All right, I should have around an hour and a half to 2 hours before I have to head out and meet with Jacob and the rest. Arthur thought as he took out his notebooks and quickly started doing his homework for the day. It was almost laughable to him how easy the homework was when you knew the entire book by heart. It didn't take longer than half an hour to complete them all, and even then it would have been faster. However, he was limited by his writing speed and the fact that he had to be careful to not make any mistakes. He didn't have an unlimited supply of notebooks, so he had to save up even on the pages. After placing the notebooks and school books back into his backpack, he headed to the kitchen where he took out one of the new rabbits that he had hunted and skinned the other day and quickly sliced off a leg. Cooking it in the stove, as usual, Arthur finished his meal in less than half an hour and then cleaned everything up before turning toward the front door, ready to head out. All right, with that, everything is ready and in order. Would love to have at least a perfume or some kind of deodorant. Arthur thought to himself as he brought his nose to smell his clothes. All right, I don't smell at least. Arthur thought before starting to walk toward the door. Krang. The front door made a loud noise as always when he pushed it open. Closing it behind him, Arthur quickly started walking away from the house and toward the meeting location in downtown Forks. They were meeting at a small park in the center of Forks. Arthur didn't really get why a park was made at all in Forks. We were literally surrounded by a large forest on every single side. There was no need for a park to be built. It's just a waste of resources, both material and human. Arthur thought as he lightly shook his head whilst walking. Beep. Hearing a car horn behind him, Arthur turned his head to check what was going on. It was a silver Volvo, a car that he knew very well before this body of his was even born. He knew it from a past life as well as from this life. It was Edward Cullen's car. Looking inside the car through the front window, Arthur saw two people, one driving whilst the other sat in the front passenger seat. Edward and Alice? What is it this time? Arthur thought, making sure to keep his mind occupied by different ideas so that his thoughts wouldn't go places when in front of the telepath. Alice, Arthur said aloud as the car stopped in front of him and the side windows rolled down. Hey, Arthur, where are you going? Alice questioned as he gave him a large smile and a wave. I'm meeting with Jacob and the others at the park. We're going to Port Angeles for some drinks tonight, Arthur said as he returned the small wave before giving Edward a small nod of his head. Drinks? Isn't that illegal at your age? What? Do you want to be a bad boy? First stealing and now drinking. You're really different from how the professors view you. Alice said, her voice clearly showing that she was joking as she gave him a sly grin. Right. Not everything is as it seems on the surface. Either way, I don't really plan on drinking. They didn't really give me a choice to refuse with how clingy Jacob is. Arthur said as he released a sigh, creating a small blow of mist in front of him. For a moment, silence reigned before the grin on Alice's expression widened even further. Right. So you don't really want to go, right? Alice questioned. Yeah, don't tell others, though. Arthur replied, his tone soft, clearly indicating that he didn't care even if they did tell others. What does she want now? Arthur thought inwardly, though he could already guess, but he was hoping that his guess wouldn't be true. Sadly, it seemed it was. Why don't you come with us then? Edward and I are going to this restaurant in Port Angeles for some food, no drinks, and probably better food. Alice asked Arthur, whilst Edward, who was behind her, simply nodded his head, showing that he didn't mind Arthur joining them. Arthur tried his best. He really did, however, her words caught him off guard, and so his mind slipped. Restaurants? You can't even eat. Arthur thought before he quickly focused his mind once more. Edward raised an eyebrow slightly as he looked at Arthur questioningly. Sure, Alice, Arthur said before walking to the back of the car and opening the door before sitting down on the back passenger seats. Yeah, Alice almost yelled with an excited tone, though it was clear that she was exaggerating. I just remembered. I don't have any money on me right now, though, Arthur said as he got ready to get out of the car. Don't worry, I'll pay for you. We're friends after all, aren't we, Arthur? Alice said as she turned her head to look at Arthur, who was seated behind her. Yeah, thanks, Alice. I'll pay you back later. Arthur replied with a soft nod of his head. Just as Edward was about to start driving once more, Alice interjected again. Wait, I'll sit with Arthur, Alice said, her expression showing a sly smirk as she got out of the car and practically pushed Arthur aside as she sat next to him. Hi, she said as she gave him a small wave. Yeah, hi, Arthur thought as his confusion only increased at the woman beside him. The confusion, however, didn't last long. Arthur had already thought about it for a while now, knowing the kind of world he was in and what kind of creature Alice was. It really wasn't hard to guess. However, Arthur tried his hardest to not think about it. However, not thinking about something right in front of you was much harder done than said. Thankfully, at this moment, Edward spoke up, saving Arthur the trouble of having to find a different topic to focus his mind on quickly. So, Arthur, you have been living in Forks for a while? Edward questioned from the driving seat. Arthur didn't reply for a moment before giving a shallow nod of his head. Yeah, ever since I was a kid, I don't really remember much about the past city where I used to live at, Arthur replied before staring at Edward through the rearview mirror. You guys only recently came to Forks, right? Arthur questioned. It wasn't Edward who answered his question. Instead, it was Alice who was already sitting closer to him than she had merely moments earlier. That's right. We used to live in Alaska, but Carlisle. Our father got a job offering at the hospital here in Forks, and so we decided to move, Alice said as her amber eyes almost seemed to twinkle while she gazed at Arthur. I see. Alaska too cold for you two? Arthur said as he turned to stare at Alice as he voiced out his words. Yup, way too cold, but I'm sure that we were able to handle it better than you could, Alice replied as her smile turned into a teasing grin. I don't doubt that, Arthur replied before he heard Edward ask him another question. The minutes passed by quickly with Arthur, Alice, and Edward conversing with each other. The questions mainly ranged on how they found it here in Forks and what they were doing for fun. I just read. I'm not really into any kind of sports, Arthur had replied to one of Edward's questions. What about you two? You don't seem to be all that into sports either. At least I haven't heard of any Cullen besides Emmett doing sports, Arthur had asked as he released a light chuckle. Alice had shaken her head with a smile before giving her answer. Well, we mostly like to go hiking and hunting. Hiking and hunting? That goes even more against the image that you've shown me until now, Arthur had replied with a slight shake of his head. Finally, after quite a while, just as the conversation had started to become drier than the Sahara Desert, the three of them had finally arrived in Port Angeles. We're here, Edward said as he slowed down the silver Volvo and parked it in a parking lot next to a medium-sized restaurant. This place is great, Alice announced as her legs almost started shaking from excitement. Arthur, who was turned to look at her, had a single thought in his mind that he finally couldn't stop. Someone with that much hyper-energy with me? How? Arthur thought, before quickly shaking his head in hopes that it would remove the thoughts, as well as hoping that Edward hadn't caught his thoughts, and if he did then hopefully he didn't think too much about them. The car finally stopped as Edward twisted the ignition key, turning the car off before opening the door and heading out. Alice and Arthur quickly follow behind him, heading out of the car and closing the doors behind them. Beep beep. Locking the car, the trio headed into the restaurant and were quickly shown to a table by a waiter who almost seemed to become entranced by Alice, and even Edward at least before he saw the third member of the group. He quickly regained his mind when he saw the average-looking, maybe even slightly malnourished Arthur. Sitting down around the table, they were quickly handed a menu to look at the food and told to call the waiter when they had decided on what they were ordering. I'll just take a medium-sized pepperoni pizza, Arthur said before standing up from the chair. Edward and Alice looked at him in confusion for a slight second before Arthur gave a slight smile and motioned toward the back with his thumb. I'm going to the bathroom real quick, Arthur said, causing Edward and Alice to give an understanding nod. Quickly turning around, Arthur headed into the bathroom and went into one of the stalls. Thankfully, they looked clean enough. This is as far as I can get, Arthur thought before his expression changed into a depreciating smile. How dumb of me to get into a car with a telepath, a vampire telepath at that willingly, and hope that I can keep my secrets. However, do I really have to keep the secret? Arthur thought before releasing a slow sigh. There's really no real reason to do so. I can just tell them to not involve me in their supernatural bullshit, and then I won't have to waste time hiding against them either, Arthur thought before giving himself a nod. Then there's the highly likely chance that Alice is my so-called mate, though it's still doubtful considering I don't feel anything for her beyond bodily lust at this point in time. Maybe that's the main sign at first. My information has gotten quite cluttered with all of the fan fiction that I read back in my past life, Arthur thought before shaking his head and finally deciding on a course of action. All right, let's head back. Opening the door of the stall, he quickly headed out of the bathroom and back into the main venue of the restaurant. Walking back to their table, he sat down and looked at Edward directly into the eyes. Hey, vampire. Hey, vampire. For a moment, Edward Cullen didn't react. A moment later, however, his eyes widened and his jaw almost dropped as he looked at the human before him. Alice quickly noticed the change in his expression as she raised an eyebrow in curiosity. Edward, Alice questioned, her voice slightly raised in confusion. Edward didn't even look at his sister, his eyes glued onto Arthur, their gaze almost piercing. Without wasting another moment, he asked, Al, Arthur simply looked at him for a moment without saying anything. Alice quickly noticed that the change in Edward's expression had been caused by Arthur, and so she turned her confused look toward him. I can't really tell you the exact details on how and why, no. It's more that I don't want you to know, though it might slip into my thoughts. Either way, I just didn't want to hide the fact that I knew, as it's honestly quite tiring, especially considering that Alice seems to be my so-called mate if I'm not wrong. Arthur said, his words low, almost a whisper as he voiced them out. The more he spoke, the more the confusion on Alice's expression turned into pure shock. At the end of his words, Alice looked and felt so shocked that she could only mutter the same words that her brother had uttered moments ago. Ow! However, Arthur didn't repeat himself again, and he obviously didn't want to delve into how he knew this information. For a few moments, silence engulfed the table. Neither of the three said a word, with the only sound being the chattering in the background from the other restaurant customers. It was Edward who broke the silence. I see. Well then, considering what you just said, you also know about our gifts. Yes, telepathy and selective future sight, or more like partial future visions. Arthur replied with a soft voice, whilst giving a shallow nod of his head. You even know about that, Alice muttered as she continued to stare at Arthur, her cold amber eyes unblinking, giving her an even more unnatural look than usual. Even her body was completely still, so unlike a human. Even if a human had tried to maintain that same stillness, they wouldn't have been able to. It was simply an impossible task. With that aside, I think we should order some food, or rather I should. You're still treating me to a meal, right? Arthur asked as he showed a small smile on his expression. It was almost instinctive from Alice, as she gave a nod in return. Thanks. Arthur replied to her nod before turning around and lifting his arm to signal the waiter to come. You ready to take your orders? The waiter asked after he arrived at their table seconds after. Yeah, I'd like a medium-sized pepperoni pizza, with a Coke on the side, please, Arthur said, causing the waiter to bring out a small notepad and pen before quickly writing down Arthur's order. The man then turned toward Edward and Alice, who quickly ordered 2 bowls of salad and a bottle of sparkling water each. Will that be all? Yes, thank you, Arthur replied, causing the waiter to give him a nod before turning around and heading toward the kitchen. So, are you really just a regular human? It was Alice who had spoken up first this time. Arthur slightly tilted his head to the right as he made an expression indicating that he was thinking about the question. It was a few moments later that he answered Alice's question. I'm actually unsure. I show all of the qualities of a human, and I most certainly don't need any kind of other food besides what regular humans need, though I do show some unusual capabilities that might be borderline supernatural, Arthur replied, causing Edward and Alice to raise an eyebrow, as they clearly asked Arthur to continue and describe more in detail just what exactly he meant by those words. However, Arthur didn't continue on until Alice couldn't hold back her curiosity anymore. Like what? Like having an almost supernatural level of control over my muscles, as well as having increased senses like smell, sight, hearing, and touch. The only thing that's completely normal about my body is my brain, unfortunately. It's quite saddening, Arthur replied as he released a sigh. Saddening? Wouldn't most boys your age want supernatural strength and senses rather than intelligence? Edward questioned. Arthur turned his gaze toward the vampire before giving a light chuckle. You're really old, aren't you? More than 100. Arthur questioned, causing Edward to frown slightly. It was at this moment that Alice came closer to Arthur suddenly and whispered, Careful, he's pretty sensitive about his age. For a moment, Arthur didn't know how to react, and in the next, he almost felt like laughing out loud. A vampire being sensitive about his age. You really learn something new every day, Arthur thought before shaking his head in disbelief. Either way, yeah, I would much prefer having increased mental capabilities rather than physical ones. In this day, and age, strength, and the like are essentially useless in having a successful future as a businessman. So your dream is to be a businessman? Alice questioned as she put her arm on the table and held her chin with her hand whilst looking at Arthur. Yes, that's my dream, becoming a successful businessman and living in a 365-bedroom house so that I can change my bedroom every night for the entire year. If possible, I'd like 365 bathrooms as well. Arthur replied, his face maintaining a completely blank expression whilst his voice sounded as serious as ever. Edward and Alice were one more left speechless as they looked at Arthur, wondering if he really had just announced what he had as his dream. Edward broke the silence again for what felt like the 100th time in this conversation. You really are a weird one, Arthur. I can't imagine what those teachers see in you. I'm starting to see why you're Alice's mate more and more. However, Edward said before releasing a long-winded sigh. Arthur didn't reply for a moment before he released an audible sigh. Actually, about that, I assumed that I was Alice's mate. However, I don't feel that much of a pull towards her as I would expect for a mate bond. Is it really confirmed that we're mates? Arthur questioned. For a brief moment, neither of the Cullens answered his question. However, Arthur clearly saw the Alice furrow her brows slightly. It was Edward who answered his question. Usually the mate bond is much stronger than what you just described your feelings as. However, it is certain that you two share a mate bond. Even if you can't feel its pull, Alice most certainly can. As so-called vampires, we don't feel love, or at least romantic love, toward anyone but our mate. This alone is enough to prove that you are her mate with 100% accuracy. Arthur gave a small nod and released a humming sound as he rubbed his chin in thought. It could be related to my own muted emotions. I already experience more emotions toward her than what I usually do. However, even then it's not that great of a pull, so it could be just that my muted emotions block a part of the mate bond's pull over me. The second reason could be because I'm not exactly a normal human, as I told you before. I think humans felt the mate bond less than vampires, even under normal circumstances. And if my human qualities are boosted up, then that could also cause the mate bond to become even meeker in the grand scheme of things. Arthur said as he draped his arm over the table and started drumming it with his fingers almost unconsciously. I see. Well, we could ask our adoptive father, Carlisle Cullen. He's pretty well versed in the medical field, and doing a few tests on you could make us understand more about how your enhanced body works. Of course, only if you agree to taking those tests, Edward replied with a soft nod of his own. At this moment, Alice interjected as she made an excited expression. Maybe Carlisle knows or has a book that describes whatever you are, Arthur. That would certainly be a lot of help, Alice said, her lips curling further as she looked at Arthur with what could only be called the expression of a religious fanatic. Right, that mate bond really does wonders on people. Arthur thought before he gave a slight nod. Turning his head toward Edward, he asked, if the mate bond was this strong, then why didn't I notice it earlier? She didn't react like this when I met her before. Arthur asked, try to ignore the fanatic who looked like she wanted to jump him right then and there. She hasn't fed in a while, and that increases her emotional fluctuations quite a bit. There's also the fact that she can act like herself more now that she doesn't have to hide her nature, Edward replied with a twitching smile. Even he hadn't known just how excited Alice would get, considering how even on regular days, she was always the most energetic and hyperactive person he had ever met. Don't talk about me as if I'm not here, Edward. I'm excited, but I'm certainly not a child. Right, sorry about that, Alice. It's just hard to match your excitement, Arthur replied as he turned his head to face her. No, you're fine, Arthur, Alice replied to his apology almost immediately. So he's fine, but I'm in trouble? Edward asked with a confused expression. Edward released an inward sigh as he thought. What was I even expecting? In her eyes, Arthur as her mate can never do anything wrong against her. If he asked her, then she would even kill herself at his orders. This is getting dangerous, however, both for the humans surrounding us as well as Arthur. Edward thought as he saw Alice's amber eyes becoming darker by the second. Alice, go home, Edward said finally. She's growing more unstable, Arthur asked at his words. Yes, she could become a danger at any moment with how things are going. Alice didn't reply for a moment, her eyes growing even darker, becoming almost obsidian black in color. All right, I'll be heading off first then. Take care of Arthur for me, Alice finally said as she got up from her seat. Her voice, even as she was talking, was becoming more guttural in its tone. Finally, she turned around and headed out of the restaurant. Why didn't you go with her? Arthur questioned as he looked at Alice's disappearing back. Edward didn't answer for a moment before he released a light chuckle. You really don't feel much of the mate bond, it seems. Even a regular human would become more agitated when they saw their own mate's emotions fluctuate that much. The reason I didn't head with her is because you would be left with no way of heading home this late at night. Edward replied as his eyes swirled from the exit door of the restaurant toward the waiter who was coming toward their table with 2 bowls of salad and a medium pepperoni pizza. Here you go, sirs. I hope you find a food to your liking. The waiter said as he gave the two a shallow gentleman's bow and then headed back off toward the kitchen once more. Arthur instantly grabbed a slice of pizza, which was still releasing steam, and stuffed it in his mouth, gobbling it down in seconds. I don't know how you guys can live without pizza, Arthur said as he continued to stuff his face with food. He had learned that free food was always the best, and that he should eat it as fast as he could so that others wouldn't come and steal it. Even though the chances of that were low, they were still there. You can slow down. No one's taking your food, Arthur. And anyways, for your question, blood tastes better, Edward replied as he simply gazed at Arthur, instead of even shooting a glance at his own salad or the pizza that Arthur was currently feasting on. Does other food taste like garbage to you guys? Or is it just that you can't stomach it and your body then regurgitates it back out? Arthur questioned as he stopped for a moment to take a gulp of his Coke. It tastes like nothing and our body rejects it. Well, not rejects it per se, but rather we can't dissolve it in our stomach, so it would be left there and rot over time. It wouldn't cause us any harm even if that did happen, however, it just isn't something we want to have in our stomach, Edward replied with a soft hum. I honestly don't remember what human food tastes like. I have this memory of it tasting good, however, I can't really describe the taste, as that part has been forgotten, however. That makes it so that I don't miss human food as I don't even remember how it tastes like, Edward said as he saw Arthur gulp down the last drop of his Coke and eat his last slice of pizza. I'll take that if you're not going to eat it, Arthur said as he quickly took Edward's and Alice's bowls of salad. Are you even listening to me? Edward asked as he had to release another sigh in frustration. It was only a few moments later when Arthur ate the entire bowls of salad that he lifted his head toward Edward and asked in his usual emotionless tone, "Did you say something?" Edward simply looked at him for a moment in bafflement before softly shaking his head. "Nothing. Are you done eating?" "Yes, I'm done," Arthur replied with a nod of his head. "All right, let's get out of here then. I'll send you back to your house." "Sure." Arthur nodded, though an array of thoughts went through his head in a split second. Do I show it to him? It doesn't matter even if he sees it. He's not the type to start rumors or talk about it. And secondly, if what he says is to be trusted, then I'm his sister's mate. Telling others besides his family wouldn't do him any good. In fact, it would only have disadvantages. Arthur thought as he gave himself a shallow nod. The two got up from their tables. Edward headed to the counter to pay for the food, whilst Arthur directly headed to the parking lot next to the restaurant. Night had already fallen, and it was completely dark. The moon was close to reaching its highest peak in the sky. "Hop in," Edward said from behind him, whilst he pocketed his wallet and unlocked the car with the key he held in the other hand. "Beep beep. I hate cars that do that," Arthur said as he opened the front passenger car door and sat before closing it. Edward quickly followed him into the car and turned the ignition key soon after closing the door to the driver's seat. "Well, it's good that this is my car then." "Yeah, sure," Arthur replied as he quickly changed the seat so that it would be more laid back. Edward immediately released a sigh. "Rosalie is going to kill me when she finds out that you changed that. Why does she usually sit here?" Arthur questioned. "Yes, she took ages to find the exact car seat position that she liked," Edward replied as he reversed out of the parking lot. "It's good that it's not my problem then," Arthur replied before turning his head to look out of the window. "Yeah, sure," Edward replied whilst his lips twitched in slight annoyance. The car ride from then on forth was quiet, with the only sound being the radio, as well as the wheels on wet asphalt, as well as the wind sound around them as Edward drove at speeds highly dangerous for anyone who wasn't a supernatural creature. "I'll die if you get hit. Slow down," Arthur practically demanded. "Thank God it's not my problem," Edward replied whilst a small grin grew on his expression before he slammed the gas pedal even further. "It's not? I'm sure my so-called mate and your sister would mind, though. Maybe I just have to send her a message," Arthur said, causing Edward to immediately remove his foot from the gas pedal. "Good boy. Arthur said emotionlessly before turning his head toward the window once more. You two are too damn similar. No, you're worse. It's like you only have her bad traits, Edward said. That makes me toxic, right? Arthur questioned absent-mindedly. No, it just makes you annoying to deal with. I see. Arthur nodded before completely ignoring Edward once more. After around half an hour, the two arrived at Forks. So which way is your house? Edward questioned. At the abandoned house near downtown Forks, Arthur replied. All right. 15 minutes later, the silver Volvo arrived in front of the abandoned house. So where to from here? Nowhere, we've arrived, Arthur replied as he removed his seatbelt and opened the car door. We've arrived? Edward questioned as he raised an eyebrow, only for his eyes to widen slightly as he saw Arthur close the car door and head toward the abandoned-looking house. That's his house, Edward thought in bafflement. He didn't drive away, simply staying seated whilst looking at Arthur heading into the house. Finally, after a few moments, Edward released a sigh and opened the door before walking toward Arthur. Come with me. Arthur simply turned toward Edward and gave him a confused look. No thanks. I like to get some sleep first before anything else. I need to conserve the energy that I gained tonight, Arthur said before opening the creaking front door. No. How can you even live here as a human? Edward questioned as he grabbed Arthur by his clothes. It is actually quite cozy. If you want, I can show you in, Arthur said in reply, his tone finally showing a sliver of emotion. It was pure annoyance. At his words, Edward released him before nodding his head and walking inside the house. Looking around, he quickly found the living room. Arthur, who walked behind him, started explaining. That over there is my stove, which I use wood to light up. I use it to cook and warm myself in the winter. Over there is my bed, and on the other side of the room is the kitchen where I keep my foods. That's it, Arthur said before he walked to the stove and quickly started to light it up. That's it? Do you call this cozy? If it wasn't for your enhanced body, then you would have already died in these conditions, Arthur, Edward said, his voice containing more and more pure annoyance as he spoke, though it was clear that one emotion trumped them all. Edward was concerned about Arthur. It was clear as day. I don't need your pity or concern, Edward Cullen. I've lived like this for years, and I enjoy having this quiet place for myself. It's not the best, but it is mine. Now you can see yourself out. I don't need your pity or concern, Edward Cullen. I've lived like this for years, and I enjoy having this quiet place for myself. It's not the best, but it is mine. Now you can see yourself out. Arthur said. His words would make one think that he was mad. However, he didn't feel much, if anything at all. He just wanted to get some sleep and be over with the day. I don't think I'll ever be able to understand you, Arthur, Edward said as he walked toward the center of the room and simply started looking around. The more he did, the more the entire room looked worse. Can you really not come with me, Arthur? I know you don't need our pity, and I don't pity you either. I just want to help you out. Is that so hard to do? Edward said after a few moments of thought. Arthur didn't reply. It wasn't that he was ignoring him or that he had a lot of thoughts in his mind. He just didn't know what to say or respond. He was stuck between two stones. On one hand, he didn't want to take the Cullens' help, as that would get him closer to the supernatural, which he really wanted to avoid. There was also the fact that Edward could read his thoughts. It was something that annoyed him to know, and however, he would have to face it either way. On the other hand, wasn't he already going to get caught up in their problems either way? How could he stay away from the supernatural world when his damn soul mate was a vampire? And so he didn't respond for a while, the only sound around them being Arthur's slow breathing and the lit stove on their right. Do you have enough room for me? I won't sleep with Alice, Arthur asked. At his words, Edward's expression seemed to light up. We do. We have a couple spare rooms, and I don't think you would survive a night in a room together with Alice. No, you probably would survive, just not as a human. Edward gave a nod as his lips curled slightly upwards. He should never smile. Makes him look like a creepy stalker. Arthur thought to himself as he looked at the young-looking man. I think my smiling face looks rather handsome, Edward replied as his lips fell into a thin line. Sure, tell yourself whatever you want, Arthur replied before releasing a deep sigh and nodding at Edward. Let's get going then. Arthur walked toward his bag, slung it over his right shoulder, and followed Edward out of the ran-down building. After getting into the car, It didn't take longer than half an hour for the two to arrive at their destination. "Looks massive," Arthur said as he looked at the large mansion in his sight. A normal human wouldn't have been able to see it clearly, however he could, his vision bordering on night vision. A moment later, Arthur turned his head toward Edward. "How far is your telepathic range?" Edward turned toward him slightly, however he didn't respond. "If you don't tell me that much, then you can forget about me staying here." It was only after those words that Edward replied, "Around 200 meters if I really concentrate." "That is annoying. I'll have to figure out a way to stop you from listening to my thoughts," Arthur said as he saw the silver Volvo start to slow down in speed. "I don't think that's going to be easy," Edward replied with a slight smile. "I don't either, jackass. However, I already have a solution, though it's going to take a while to put into action." "What is it?" Edward questioned. "Before I answer that, what languages do you know?" Arthur asked instead of answering Edward's question. Edward raised an eyebrow. "I see. So you're planning to start thinking in a language that I don't know, however, that's not going to be easy. You'll have to learn a new language and gain enough fluency in it that you can turn all your thinking in that language subconsciously," Edward said before his lips curled upward once more. "I know English, Spanish, French, German, and Italian." "That takes out the easiest ones," Arthur said in dissatisfaction. The car finally stopped, and the two got out and started walking toward the door. "Have they already noticed us?" "I'd assume so," Arthur asked. He had decided that he would just speak out his mind when around Edward. It was useless to try and hide his thoughts for now, at least. They're all waiting in the living room. Alice is freaking out. I thought she'd be more stable." "You're only saying that because you can't feel the bond," Edward replied before releasing a barely audible sigh and opening the front door. "I fear for my future. Just imagining two Alices, it's frightening." "You decided to bring me here. If I die, I'll come back and haunt you as a ghost," Arthur said suddenly. It didn't even sound like a joke when it came out with Arthur's emotionless voice. "I am shivering," Edward replied in a flat tone similar to Arthur's as they headed in. Walking through one more door, the duo arrived in the living room. Arthur immediately turned his gaze to the 6 vampires seated around the room on black leather couches. Arthur quickly put a name to each face. On the far left, 3 people were seated: Rosalie Hale, Jasper Hale, Emmett Cullen. Closer to Edward and Arthur were 2 people: Carlisle Cullen and Esme Cullen. And finally, on the right side of the room, a short woman was pacing back and forth before stopping to look at Arthur. Alice Cullen. Arthur quickly turned his gaze away and looked at Carlisle and the rest of the Cullens besides Alice. "Hello, I'll be staying here. Don't drink my blood, it's nasty." "Hello, I'll be staying here. Don't drink my blood, it's nasty." For a moment, silence engulfed the entire mansion as the vampires stared at Arthur, their expressions changing to ones of confusion and befuddlement as they gazed at the confident human who had just strolled in. "What?" Emmett thought in confusion before his mind quickly computed the words. And in the very next moment, the larger-like vampire, Emmett Cullen, curled up as he started laughing at the pitch of his lungs, as if what he had just heard had been the funniest joke in existence. "Is something wrong with his head?" Arthur questioned as he turned his gaze toward Edward. "Probably," Edward replied with a soft smirk before he walked closer to the rest of the Cullens, Arthur following behind him. "I look like a duck following behind him," Arthur thought as he stared at the faces of the vampires around the room. An ugly duck. Arriving in the living room, Arthur turned his head toward the other vampires besides Edward. The first to greet him were the parents, Carlisle and Esme Cullen. "It's a pleasure meeting you, Arthur, though I hope you don't mind that we didn't prepare anything," Carlisle said, his facial expression soft, so soft in fact that he looked like he couldn't hurt a fly. "Arthur Moriarty, it's a pleasure meeting you, Oswell Carlisle," Arthur replied, taking the man's hand and giving him a handshake. Turning his head to the right, he gave Carlisle's wife a greeting as well. "You must be Esme Cullen. It's a pleasure meeting you too," Arthur said as he extended his hand. However, the woman didn't even deign his hand a look before she engulfed Arthur in a hug. "Oh, okay," Arthur thought as he gave her an awkward pat on the back. "Sorry about that. It's just so great that we can meet you so soon." "Right, it's great," Arthur replied, not really knowing how to respond to the woman's words. Walking past the two, he was met with 3 people: Emmett Cullen, as well as the Hale siblings. It's a pleasure meeting you all as well. I hope we get along well, Arthur said as he offered a handshake. However, the only one who took it was Emmett Cullen, whilst the Hales were only staring at him. It's nice to finally be able to see Alice's fabled mate. I'm Emmett. If you need anything, just ask me. Emmett replied as he gave a chuckle. Sure, I'll make great use of that promise, Arthur replied as he gave the man a serious nod. Considering Arthur's tone rarely changed, it sounded like he had taken everything Emmett had said at face value and wasn't joking at all. Emmett gave another chuckle before stepping back. Turning his head, Arthur was once more met with Rosalie Hale and Jasper Hale. One looked like she despised him to the very core, whilst the other looked like he was suffering as if he was being stabbed repeatedly over and over. You don't like humans, and you are barely able to control your urges. It was nice meeting you, bye, Arthur said before turning around and heading toward the last Cullen in the room. At his words, Jasper and Rosalie's expressions changed as they turned to look at Arthur walking away. A gift? No idea, Edward replied to their question. Well, he certainly is interesting, Emmett offered as he kept a large smile on his face. Meanwhile, Arthur arrived in front of Alice Cullen. Hey, I'm staying a night here. Edward didn't leave me any other choice. I did not, Edward said almost instantly. He had to immediately deny the accusation. Saying something like that to Alice was dangerous. Not for Arthur, but dangerous for him. This guy. Alice giggled in response before nodding. All right, I need to head out to hunt for a while with Emmett, Rosalie, and Jasper. See you tomorrow, Arthur. Alice replied as she gave him a nod and motioned for the others to follow her. Arthur saw Alice start running with Emmett, Jasper, and Rosalie quickly following behind her. They sure are fast. I'd say around 200 kilometers an hour, maybe slightly slower. Arthur mumbled as he turned to face Edward, Carlyle, and Esme, the only ones left in the room. You can see them? Carlyle questioned, his curiosity piqued as he looked at Arthur. That's something, Edward, and I wanted to question you about, actually, Arthur replied as he walked to the couch and sat down, the others quickly following suit. Carlyle was sitting on the small couch next to Arthur together with Esme, whilst Edward sat on the couch opposite to Arthur. My body is weird, extremely so, and I showcase almost supernatural levels of strength and speed as well as senses. I was wondering if you would be able to figure out if I'm just an enhanced human or some other species. Arthur asked calmly despite how heavy of a topic this was. I can try, however, I would need to research your powers extensively, and even then, I am not confident that I can find what you are with a 100% chance of success, Carlyle replied as he brought a hand and held his chin in thought. That's fine, though let's do that tomorrow. Having dinner with your son and daughter was quite tiring. Can you show me to a bedroom, please? Arthur said as he released an exaggerated sigh, though because of the tone of his voice, as always he sounded completely serious. I'm sure it was quite hectic, apologies, Carlyle said with a soft smile as he got up, ready to show Arthur to his bedroom. It wasn't hectic at all, he's just as bad as Alice, Edward replied slowly, releasing the 1000th sigh of the evening. Sure, whatever you say, Arthur said to Edward as he passed by him. Carlyle led Arthur to the second floor of the mansion, through a large hallway filled with white modern wooden doors on either side. As the two walked, no conversation was made. It was clear that both of them had a similarity. They enjoyed silence and didn't feel in the least awkward with the silence surrounding them. A few moments later, the two arrived in front of a door situated at the end of the hallway to the right. Since you're Alice's mate, I put your room next to yours if you want to change it, however, do tell Arthur. Carlyle finally spoke up as he turned to look at Arthur. No, it's fine as long as she doesn't lose her mind in the middle of the night and decides that I'm a great midnight snack. Literally, Arthur said in return as he opened the bedroom door. Walking inside, he saw a white rood with dark wooden accents all around. If Arthur had to give a description in one word, then it would most definitely be rich. There was no other word that could describe this bedroom better. Everything in it clearly was designed just for this house and was handmade. That wasn't just regular expensive furniture. It was furniture designed specifically for this room and then crafted by a master of his craft. Doctor, are you secretly a cartel lord? Arthur questioned as he walked toward the large king-size bed. Sitting on it made one feel as if they were sat on top of puffy white clouds. I was one around 60 or so years ago, Carlyle replied. At his words, Arthur quickly raised his head to gaze at the man. I'm just joking. You shouldn't joke around when you say stuff like that. It looks believable, Arthur replied, not realizing that he sounded like a complete hypocrite. With his almost emotionless expression, he looked more convincing than Carlyle when he told lies that it was hard, if not almost impossible to notice when he was indeed lying. Carlyle clearly had the same thought as he raised his eyebrow slightly before releasing a small chuckle. All right, now then I'll leave you to sleep. Good night, Arthur, Carlyle said as he turned around and left the room, closing the door behind him. Arthur immediately laid down on the bed and closed his eyes, thinking about white sheep jumping over a fence so that he could lull himself to sleep. It was a task of importance, as when stuck inside a room and laid on the bed, it was the time where his mind wandered the most, and with a telepath in the house, that certainly wasn't what Arthur wanted. Thankfully, he had found that his control over his thoughts was much better than he had thought possible. Must be another enhancement, Arthur mumbled before quickly shaking his head and reining his thoughts in once more back to the fence and the white jumping sheep. 1 sheep, 2 sheep, 3 sheep. It didn't take more than 2 minutes before Arthur was out cold on the bed, sleeping soundly. On the other side of the house, Edward had a complex expression on his face. What's wrong? Esme questioned as she was cooking something in the kitchen. It feels like I've made a grave mistake brining that guy here, Edward replied as he sat down on the kitchen table. Why? Do you not like him? Carlyle questioned as he arrived downstairs. It's not about liking him or not liking him. It's about the fact that his attitude and thoughts are almost a replica of Alice, besides being a lot more emotionless and dull, Edward said as he crossed his arms and lied back against the chair. He sure is interesting. If what you're saying is true, then I can think of a couple mental diseases, Carlyle replied as he walked toward the counter in the kitchen and took out what looked like a wine bottle. Instead of wine, however, it was filled with animal blood that he kept around. Do you want a drink? Carlyle questioned as he poured the blood into a wine glass. No, Edward replied as he got up and started heading outside of the mansion. You know that he doesn't like drinking blood, Carlyle, Esme said as she released a sigh. If only he could finally accept that being a vampire doesn't make one a monster, Carlyle said as he took a sip, his eyes closing in contemplation about the entire matter around Arthur Oswell as Edward, the man who thought of himself as nothing more than a monster. He just needs to find his mate, Esme said before both her and Carlyle turned toward the front door of the mansion. In almost an instant, 4 blurry figures entered into the living room. Edward's mate, she's coming, Alice said as she practically jumped up in excitement. Esme almost couldn't hold herself back as she brought her hand to her mouth. If she had been able to then, she would have already shed tears of joy. A moment later, however, Alice, Emmett, Jasper, and Rosalie turned towards the front door once more. There stood Edward with a frown on his face. I'm not meeting them. End of story, Edward announced, his voice cold. I'm not meeting them. End of story, Alice, Edward said as he turned to head upstairs. Why, Edward? Why do you make yourself suffer? Alice questioned, her voice raised. Her words caused Edward to stop as he was walking up the stairs. Because I don't want to ruin someone's life. Then am I ruining Arthur's life? Edward? Alice questioned immediately. Her emotions had clearly taken hold of her. At her words, Edward turned around. He faced his entire family, however his gaze was focused on Alice. It's different, Alice. You can't ruin something that's already in shambles. You can't ruin a life that isn't even there. You've seen how Arthur lives. That's not even human anymore. I will do the same if my mate is in the same situation as Arthur is, however, if she was in his situation, Edward said before stopping for a moment, his brows furrowing. They would already be dead, Alice. Arthur isn't exactly your typical human. That's the main reason he could live as he did. With those final words, Edward turned around and headed upstairs. Alice didn't stop him this time. What does he mean by that, Alice? Esme questioned, her question causing everyone left in the room to turn their attention towards the pixie-like vampire. Alice didn't respond for a while before she released a soft sigh. I'm sure he told you, Carlisle, but Arthur isn't really a typical human if he's one at all, Alice said as she walked towards the sofa, the rest of the family following her curiously. He's been living in the abandoned house at downtown Forks for years now. He lives by hunting wildlife in the forest. However, even that is scarce these days and quite hard to catch during the winter. Alice replied before she closed her eyes. It was clear that she was in pain. It wasn't physical pain. That was easy to figure out, and it wouldn't affect a cold one. It was unforgiving emotional pain, pain that she couldn't have experienced on her own. It was the pain that she felt almost every night since she had learned about Arthur and his life after sneaking inside that one time. I see. Well, he's certainly quite special, Emmett said as he crossed his arms. For once his tone wasn't joking. His expression wasn't the usual happy-go-lucky expression that he seemed to always have etched on his face. Either way, I'm going to hunt for a while more. Staying this close to Arthur is turning out to be harder than expected, Alice said as she stood up once more. I'll leave Edward's matter to him. At the end of the day, as much as I want him to be happy, it's his own choice, Alice said as she prepared to launch in a super-speed sprint towards the outside of the mansion and into the woods, in search of roaming deer. He said that he doesn't feel the bond, Carlisle said suddenly, causing Emmett, Jasper, and Rosalie to turn their surprised gaze toward Carlisle. Yeah, he certainly doesn't feel it much. At most, it's a physical attraction from what Edward told me, Alice said as she released another sigh, hoping to calm her emotional fluctuations. It doesn't matter, however, Alice said after a few moments, her tone of voice clearly showing her determination and grit. I'll make him understand. I'll make him feel that I'm the right one, Alice said as a large smile split her face. For a moment, it almost seemed like she was radiating light as her determination and love for Arthur shined through. At her words, Esme Cullen, the woman who had adopted so many children, showed a soft smile. I'm glad, Alice. I'm so glad. Alice didn't say any more before she disappeared in a blur of speed. Seconds turned into minutes, and finally minutes into hours. After 7 hours, the sun had already risen over the horizon, though its shine was still blocked by the large clouds in the sky over Forks. Arthur woke up, his body immediately tensing as he practically jumped from the bed, his speed astounding for a regular human. Even an action as simple as jumping from the bed was made to look masterful by Arthur's instincts. It was as if he was a master martial artist or gymnast. Right, I'm at the Cullens, Arthur mumbled a moment later, before releasing a sigh as his muscles relaxed once more. It's been so long since I slept over at someone else's house that I thought I was kidnapped for a moment there. Arthur's thoughts came to a stop at that sentence. He immediately gained a clear state of mind. Careful, Arthur thought before turning around to look at the bed he had slept on. Next to the bed was a set of folded clothes, clearly meant for him. Arthur didn't waste a moment before changing into the clothes. When you're as poor as me, you can't look at a gift horse in the mouth, Arthur thought to himself as he quickly changed into his new set of clothes. It was a pair of black jeans that were clearly made of high-quality material, as well as a white turtleneck sweater. These fit quite well, Arthur said before his mind immediately went to the wayside. They couldn't have. At this moment, the door of his bedroom opened, and inside came Edward and Alice. We didn't molest you. We didn't molest you, Edward said, already feeling tired from his first interaction with Arthur. Right, Arthur replied as he turned towards the right side of the room where a full-body mirror stood. They're pretty good. I'm glad you like them. She took ages to pick out what she thought was the perfect outfit for you, Edward said as he motioned towards Alice. Right. Thanks, Alice, Arthur replied as he gave a nod to the woman before turning his gaze towards Edward once more. Let's go downstairs. What time is it? We have to go to school, Arthur said as he started walking towards the duo. We still have around half an hour before we have to get going. Don't forget your backpack, Edward said as he motioned towards the backpack sitting next to the bed. Next to his usual backpack, however, sat a new one, clearly made out of much better materials. A new backpack? Arthur questioned as he turned towards Alice. Yeah, technically you don't feel the bond, but to me, you're more important than my own life, Arthur. So whatever you want to need, just tell me, okay? Alice replied as a large smile appeared on her face. Arthur felt a slight change in his emotions, however, it too quickly died down. It's a bit uncomfortable for me when you say that. Arthur thought to himself as he took the books out of his old backpack and placed them inside his new one quickly before closing it and slinging it over his right shoulder. "All right, let's head down," Edward said, nodding his head before turning around and walking outside of the room. The three walked through the long hall and down the extravagant stairs before they arrived in the living room. Arthur quickly saw three people seated around the sofa and Esme in the kitchen, cooking from the looks of it. On the right side of the sofa sat Emmett and Rosalie, whilst on the left side sat Carlyle. "Good morning," Arthur said as he raised his hand in a small wave before lowering it once again. "Good morning, Arthur. Did you sleep well?" Esme immediately replied from the kitchen. "Yes, it was pleasant. You don't have to make food for me," Arthur said as he turned towards the woman. "I just always wanted to do it. Of course, you can choose not to eat it. Don't feel pressured." The woman replied with a soft smile. "I see. In that case, thank you then. I'm sure it will be tasty," Arthur replied before turning towards the rest of the room. "Hey, Arthur," Emmett said as he practically shouted whilst calling Arthur over. "Hey, Emmett," Arthur replied before he went ahead and sat on the couch in front of the large man. "I see you like the clothes Alice picked for you?" Carlyle questioned at this moment as he gave Arthur a small wave. "Yes, they fit perfectly," Arthur replied with a serious nod of his head. "Too perfectly." Edward hardened his gaze again as he looked at Arthur before he turned his eyes away a moment later and released a deep sigh. "The food's ready, Arthur," Esme called out from the kitchen. Arthur nodded before sitting up from the couch. "Well, if you don't mind, I'll get some food before we head off towards school," Arthur said as he gave Emmett, Alice, Rosalie, and Edward a quick glance and turned towards the kitchen, walking towards the dining table. It was large. It looked like it could fit more than 12 people at the same time. "Why did you get such a large table, Mr. Carlyle? You don't even use it," Arthur questioned as he sat down at the top of the table, the part closest to the kitchen. "Esme designed the entire house, so it was her decision," Carlyle replied from the other side of the room. "It was just a preference, and I felt like it fit the room design better," Esme said as she placed a plate in front of Arthur. It was a simple morning breakfast consisting of 2 scrambled eggs, some pieces of cheese, and a tomato, as well as 2 sausages. "Thank you for the meal," Arthur said in thanks to Esme, giving her a nod at the same time before he looked down at the plate and dug into the food. Edward had a slight smile as he looked at the rest of the Cullens. It didn't take more than 30 seconds for the entire plate to be cleaned, as if it had been thrown into the washer for 12 hours. Alice's jaw already lowered whilst Emmett looked like his eyes were about to pop out. "He's certainly unique," Carlyle said, causing a smirk to appear on Edward's face. "I knew it wasn't just me," Edward thought to himself before he released a light chuckle. Getting up from his seat at the dinner table, Arthur took the paper napkin that Esme had given him with the food earlier, cleaned his face slowly, and then pushed the chair back in. "Thank for the food once more. It was delicious," Arthur said in thanks to the woman once more before turning toward Arthur and Alice. He didn't say anything, however, Alice quickly understood the meaning of his gaze. "Right, let's get going," she said after a short momentary pause. "See you later, Miss Esme, Mr. Carlyle," Arthur said as he gave the two a wave before following Alice and Edward, who had already started to walk towards the front door of the mansion. "Are you coming with?" Arthur asked as he turned towards Emmett just before he headed out. "No, I'll be coming a bit later with Rosalie and Jasper." "All right." And with those final words, Arthur headed out of the mansion and into the silver Volvo together with Alice and Edward. Once the car left the garage and onto the road, Edward questioned Alice, his tone much more serious than what Arthur had heard it be before. "When do I meet her?" "I don't know. It could be today or next week or even years later," Alice replied. "Who are you talking about?" Arthur questioned curiously. "His mate. You don't want to meet her, right?" Arthur questioned as he watched the passing scenery out of the window to his right. "So you don't want to meet her, right?" Arthur questioned as he kept looking at the passing scenery of the forest while the Volvo drove toward Forks High School. "You know about that too, huh?" Edward mumbled as he kept his sight fixed on the road ahead of them. "I can't say anything about your choice, as it's yours at the end of the day. However, I suggest that once you make a choice, stick to it. At the same time, you should give your mate a chance to influence that choice as well, considering this is a matter that concerns both of you," Arthur said before returning to silence once more. "I guess you're right, Arthur. However, I don't think I can give them that choice." "It's not even a choice in the first place," Edward muttered in reply. Silence engulfed the car after those last words, the only sound being the noise caused by the wheels of the car as they drove toward the school. After a while, the car slowly started to slow down. They had arrived at their destination, Forks High School. "How are you going to explain practically ditching your friends?" Alice questioned, a light smirk showing on her expression. "I'll just say that something came up. Sometimes the best lie is the simplest one. This way, you don't have to remember every detail of your complex lie and have fewer chances of messing it up and revealing the truth later down the line." Arthur replied with a light hum. "I see. Experienced liar?" Alice questioned, her tone clearly showing her amusement. "To a certain degree." With those final words, the silver Volvo parked itself on the right side of the school parking lot. Twisting the key, Edward shut the engine off and turned toward Alice and Arthur. "Let's go." Without waiting any further, all three of them headed out of the car. "We're going to be waiting for a bit for the others to arrive. Are you staying with us?" Alice turned to face Arthur and asked. "Sure. It's not like I have anything else to do." Arthur replied with a light nod and backed up so that he could use the car as support to stay up. It was at this moment that a loud, crackling noise was heard. KKRRVHHH. Turning his head to the other side of the parking lot, Arthur saw a large orange truck parking itself. "New student?" Arthur questioned aloud as he focused, trying not to let any stray thoughts complicate things. "Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen that before. I would surely remember something as loud as that." Edward nodded, affirming Arthur's question. A moment after the truck stopped, its driver's side door slammed open, and out came a young girl, looking to be around 17 years old, with long brown hair and a complexion as pale as paper. "It's her, isn't it?" Edward questioned Alice as he slightly turned his gaze toward her. "Yeah," Alice confirmed his thoughts. "So are you meeting her?" Arthur questioned immediately after. "No, maybe later, but not right now. I'm still thinking about it," Edward replied before turning his head toward the entrance of the parking lot. There, a large red Jeep was entering the parking lot. "Seems like the rest are here as well. Well then, I'll also be heading off. It's close to the start of the classes. Don't want to miss them," Arthur said as he opened the car door once more, took out his new backpack, and slung it over his shoulder, giving Edward and Alice a small wave. "See you during lunch break?" Alice said as she gave a wave of her own. "Yeah, sure." With those words, Arthur started walking toward the school. Coincidentally, when he arrived, he saw Bella Swan, Edward's mate, falling down right next to him. With his close to superhuman reflexes, Arthur didn't have a single issue lowering himself down to catch her fall. However, he stopped himself. Those two are just an annoyance to deal with. I'll leave it to them to figure that out, Arthur thought as he walked past Bella, hearing a small grunt of pain only a split moment later. She's as much of a klutz as described in the books, huh? Entering the school, Arthur quickly went through 2 different hallways before he arrived at his first class of the day. It was biology today. The class was easy enough, having already learned the entire book. It was almost an easy daily routine nowadays for Arthur to complete the class and answer the professor's every question. The next few classes were much the same: physics and calculus. After finishing the 3 classes, it was finally time for the lunch break. Rang. With a loud sound, the bell signaling the end of the class rang, and Arthur stood up from his seat at the end of the class by the windows. Another day, another boring class lesson, Arthur thought to himself as he started carefully packing his books into his backpack. Looking down at the calculus book in his hands, he noticed that it had already started to deteriorate. Looks like this one won't last much longer, Arthur thought in frustration before sliding the book into his backpack. Closing the zipper, he slung the backpack over his right shoulder and started walking out of the class toward the cafeteria. The start of the plot, huh? I guess things will start to get more interesting from now on. The start of the plot, huh? I guess things will start to get more interesting from now on, Arthur thought to himself as he walked through the hallways of the school. His destination? The school cafeteria. The time it took to arrive, there wasn't long. Merely a minute or two, usually, however, that was only when the hallways were clear of students. And at lunch break, the hallways were never clear of students. In fact, it was like walking through a horde of zombies that pushed each other constantly as they tried to head to the cafeteria as quickly as they could to fill their hungering stomachs. And so Arthur decided to sit at the back of the zombie horde and merely wait it out instead of pushing through. I could probably spear throt each and every one of them, however, that would just create a bigger commotion and cause me trouble that's not needed at all. Arthur thought to himself as he slowly walked whilst keeping a distance. Turning to the left side of the hall, Arthur saw the new student, Bella Swan. Because of her popularity, it seemed like she got a free pass to the cafeteria as the students turned to look at her after their friends told them to. This indirectly caused Bella's road to the cafeteria to clear. Well, don't mind if I do, Arthur thought as he quickly followed behind her, managing to pass almost all of the students easily and arrive ahead of the line. Seeing the cafeteria doors in front of him, Arthur released a shallow sigh of relief. I might be able to get some time to actually sit down this time, Arthur thought before heading inside and looking around. He quickly found his usual group of friends. "Hey, Arthur," Jacob called him over almost immediately. Arthur gave the kid a nod before walking towards him. "Hey, Jacob, what's up? Why did you ditch on us yesterday, man? It's no fun when you aren't with," Jacob asked as he put his arm around Arthur's neck. "I realized I had something more important to do," Arthur replied as he swiftly took off Jacob's arm around his neck. "Oh, what was it?" Jacob and the other boys quickly turned their eyes in interest. "I went out with someone. Either way, from now on I'll probably be sitting with her, so I won't be able to come with you all as much, but I'll still make out some time when I can," Arthur replied with a soft nod of his head. "You went out with a girl?" The group practically screamed as they looked at the goody two-shoes Arthur in absolute bafflement. "That late at night, too?" Jacob questioned, before a smirk appeared on his face. "So who's the lucky gal?" "Alice," Arthur replied, as his gaze turned towards the end of the hall where the Cullens table stood. The Cullens had turned their attention towards Arthur. Most interesting were the gazes of Alice and Edward. One had her eyes widened and mouth almost hung open, whilst the other looked at him in complete puzzlement. "Well, just wanted to tell y'all about it. I'll be going then," Arthur said as he turned to face the group in front of him once more. "All right, man, go get her," Jacob replied with a smile as he patted Arthur's back. His words make him sound as if he's the most supporting friend in existence. However, your intent is quite the opposite, Jacob, Arthur thought as he looked at his supposed friend. Another pseudo-ability of sorts, or more like a side effect of his ability to sense murderous intent, was the ability to sense when someone had negative emotions towards oneself. And currently Jacob and his crew of henchmen was radiating it as bright as the rays of the sun. "Sure, bye," Arthur replied, his brows furrowing slightly before he turned to walk towards Alice. It was at this moment that he heard something behind him. In an instant, his body turned around on reflex, only to see a plate of food heading towards him. It looked as if Jacob had slipped, however the smirk on his face told a completely different story. With superhuman reflexes and balance, Arthur quickly sighed, stepped the plate and the food that was falling towards him. Clang. "Be careful, Jacob. You could have gotten hurt," Arthur said, his gaze piercing as he looked at Jacob before turning around and walking toward the Cullen table, his hands already in his pockets, as if what had just happened hadn't happened to him, but to someone else, someone unimportant. "Hey, we meet again, blood lickers," Arthur mumbled as he grabbed a chair and pulled it towards the Cullen table before sitting down. Sitting down, Arthur first turned toward Alice, who was to his right, before motioning with his head towards her plate of food that had been left untouched. "You mind if I grab that?" "No, go ahead," Alice replied with a slight smile as she pushed her food tray towards Arthur. "Thanks." With that final word, Arthur immediately went into his food looking like a starved animal as he ate the food at an incredible speed. "I can never get used to that," Edward mumbled as he looked at Arthur. Alice, who was next to him, gave a slight nod as well. "So, are you all right, Arthur? Those guys don't seem like they will let this go." It was Emmett who had put forward the question as his eyebrows furrowed slightly. Taking his head out of his food, Arthur turned towards the bear-like vampire and gave a nod. "I don't think they can do anything really," At most, they could try and start spreading rumors. However, I can easily get rid of them using the teachers. If not that, then they could try to physically attack me. However, that won't really turn out great for them. Arthur replied, before turning to continue eating his food once more. Are you sure you can take on 5 of them at the same time? They're all pretty well built. Emmett asked as he gave a light hum. Should be easy enough. My physical abilities are higher than a regular human, but not by much. However, even that makes me a lot stronger than a regular teenager like them. That's good, Jasper interjected. Hearing his voice made Arthur turn his head suddenly before he gave a nod. He talks so rarely that I almost forgot he existed. Arthur thought to himself before he heard it. The surrounding murmurs of the students started dying down as the door of the cafeteria was opened once more. A slight deviation, Arthur thought to himself before he immediately erased all thoughts from his mind. The reason for the newfound silence in the cafeteria was one person, Bella Swan, daughter of Charlie Swan, the chief police of Forks, the sole mate of Edward Cullen, a future gifted vampire, and the main protagonist of the original story. The girl looked so much different from the person that she would become later on down the line. It was slightly jarring to Arthur. The future capable vampire was now but a clumsy young girl entering the cafeteria of her new high school for the first time. I say she looks pretty all right, Arthur mumbled, causing Edward and Alice to swerve their attention toward him. What? I mean, if she's your soul mate, then you should want her to at least be good-looking, right? Arthur replied with his usual deadpan tone. Sigh. Edward simply released a long-winded sigh before turning his attention away from Arthur. Then do I look good, Arthur? Alice immediately questioned without missing a single beat. However, you look great, Arthur replied, though, because his tone was so flat, it didn't sound like he actually meant it, even if he did. Right, thanks, Alice replied, her expression showing a twitching smile. You should learn how to put more emotion in your lies, Arthur, Emmett interjected with a slight smirk on his face. Arthur only raised an eyebrow as he replied. I wasn't lying, however. While I don't feel this almost spiritual pull that Alice seems to feel coming from me, I do see Alice as an extremely beautiful girl. At his words, Alice felt her lips twist upwards fully as her eyes slowly started darkening. The amber shine slowly turning darker and darker. Jasper, get Alice out of here. Rosalie spoke up for the first time. What's wrong? Alice questioned as she turned toward her sister. You're losing control again. Arthur should control what he says. Hearing what she said, Arthur turned to face Alice and gave a slight nod. You're already showing signs of losing control. Sorry, Alice. It's all right, Arthur. Let's go, Jasper, Alice said in return before taking Jasper with her and heading out of the cafeteria. Meanwhile, on the other side of the cafeteria hall, 2 people were talking. So who are they? Those are the Cullens and Arthur Moriarty. Who are they? Bella Swan questioned. Well, the Cullens are just this weird group who thinks they're above everyone else, and they're all totally freaky too. Jessica Stenely replied. The large one that looks like a bodybuilder is Emmett Cullen. He's together with the one to his left. That blonde is Rosalie Hale. Together? Bella questioned, surprise evident on her face. Yeah, like together as in a couple, Jessica replied before she turned her eyes to the next Cullen discreetly. Those 2 that are getting up are Jasper and Alice. They're just straight-up weirdos. One of them looks like he's in pain all the time, whilst the other is just annoying and acts like everyone is her friend. That's not a nice thing to say, Jessica. A voice interjected from the other side of their table. Oh, come on. Even you know that it's true, Angela, Jessica replied before turning toward the last participants. Who's that guy then? Bella questioned as she motioned towards the tall, brown-haired man with amber eyes. That's Edward Cullen. He's a prick who thinks no one is good enough for him, Jessica replied before her eyes turned towards the last person. And that guy at the top of the table is Arthur Moriarty. He's like the best student in the country or something. He's a total genius. He's usually with a different group. I don't know why he's with the Cullens really, but you shouldn't try to interact with him, Jessica said as she released a soft sigh of disappointment. What? Bella questioned, her tone of voice clearly showing her confusion. Just like Edward, he thinks he's better than everyone else. Okay, Bella replied, her voice clearly showing how meek her personality was. On the other side of the cafeteria, Arthur asked Edward as he turned to face him. I'm not like you, am I? No, you're not like me. You're much worse, Edward replied without missing a beat. Considering how contrived your mind is, that actually means by societal standards, I am better, Arthur mumbled as he turned to face away before speaking once more. Are you just going to let her give Bella a bad impression about you? It doesn't really matter, Arthur, Emmett interjected before Edward could reply. It doesn't, Arthur questioned before stopping for a moment and then giving a soft nod. I suppose it's right considering how strong the bond Alice feels is. If it works similarly for Edward and Bella, then bad rumors won't really even be considered at the end of the day, Arthur said before releasing a soft sigh. I'm glad I'm not like that, Arthur said as he looked in Bella's direction, his eyes briefly meeting with hers before the girl quickly turned her eyes away in what looked almost like fright. Not really a social butterfly, is she? Arthur thought before he heard Rosalie question him. And why is that? It would make me feel like I'm actually being manipulated and that those emotions aren't really mine, especially with how muted my other emotions are. It would bring me to a point where I would doubt Alice so much that a relationship between us would be impossible, Arthur replied. Though the topic wasn't exactly lighthearted, his tone of voice was completely nonchalant, as if he was talking about how he liked to eat his morning rabbit leg. The Cullens at the table sat silent. It was at this moment that the bell, signaling the end of lunch break, rang. Getting up from his seat, Arthur gave the three a light smile. Don't mind my words, however. That is only the case for someone with muted emotions. For others, it would feel completely normal and a part of life. I guess you could even say that having a soul mate is just as natural to one's life as their birth and death, Arthur said before getting his starting to walk toward his next class. He's really unsettling, Emmett said as he stood up. Ow! Edward questioned as he and Rosalie stood up from their seat as well. Being able to completely rationalize one's emotions in life isn't something a regular person does now, is it? Emmett replied with a low chuckle. The three didn't discuss any more as they headed out of the cafeteria. Droves of students around them similarly walked towards their next classes for the day. Hours passed, with Arthur pushing through the boring classes one after the other. With a ring, the bell signaling the end of the classes for the day was heard. Getting up from his seat slowly, he quickly put the book he had on the table inside his backpack and closed the zipper before slinging it over his right shoulder and starting to walk away. Hey, did you hear? A murmur rang out in the hallway as Arthur passed by. Hear what? Arthur's going out with insane Alice. Really? I would have never thought that, even in my dreams. Yeah, he even insulted all his other friends at the cafeteria. Jacob looked so hurt. I guess the perfect student really doesn't exist. Walking through the halls, Arthur heard more and more whispers. So you really decided to go against me, Jacob? Arthur thought, as his already cold eyes seemed to almost become covered in a cold, frosty mist. Looking ahead of him, Arthur saw Jacob together with his small group of friends, or hooligans as Arthur decided to call them. For a moment the boy turned his head, his eyes meeting Arthur's gaze. Arthur could clearly see it, the joy and ridicule held towards him in those eyes. Walking at a moderate pace, Arthur arrived right behind the group. Jacob had already turned his gaze away, ignoring Arthur. Walking closely, Arthur stepped right next to Jacob, who turned his attention to the new arrival. Wah! Before he could say a word, Arthur opened his mouth and whispered, So the failed athlete who has feelings for his stepmother wants to fight me. For a moment, Jacob didn't react. In the very next moment, however, his pupils enlarged as rage took hold of his mind. You trashy bastard, Jacob shouted as he pushed Arthur to the ground and started punching his face. I just wanted to apologize, Jacob. I just wanted to tell you guys that I didn't know I did something wrong, Arthur said loudly, his voice sounding almost broken. It was at this moment that Jacob stopped, however, it was much too late. A large number of students were surrounding the two, and there they stood, Jacob on top of Arthur, his fist colored red in blood. One might find it odd. The amount of blood was too large for such a quick scuffle, and there hadn't been any weapons involved. Arthur's nose wasn't even broken, so how was his hand covered in blood? Arthur had forcibly bitten various locations in his own mouth, as well as forcibly erupted the blood vessels in his nose right before he had gotten entangled with Jacob. Those preparations had given him the method to create a scene as horrific as this one. "Stop, Jacob," one of the students said as they looked at the scene. It was at this moment that one of the teachers heading out of the classrooms saw the sight. The man's mind went blank for a moment at the sight before he quickly rushed towards the two and practically tore Jacob off of Arthur. "Someone get him to the infirmary," the man said as he quickly ordered a few random students before turning toward Jacob. "First you spread those rumors, and now you do this, Jacob," the man screamed in the boy's face. The rest of the students to the side clearly hearing the words. "Fake rumors? Does that mean that Arthur didn't do anything today?" "I can't believe it. Jacob went that far." The new murmurs quickly spread like wildfire. "You are coming to the principal's office tomorrow morning before classes," the teacher quickly announced as he followed behind Arthur, who was being helped by a few students so that he could walk towards the school infirmary. Meanwhile, Edward Cullen, who stood outside the school in the parking lot, quickly learned of what had happened. His facial expression quickly turned upside down as a deep frown appeared on his face. "Emmett, take the others home. I need to stay for a while longer." "Why? What's wrong?" Emmett questioned, only to be given a look by Edward. "All right." With those words, the rest of the Cullen vampires headed away in the Jeep, whilst Edward stood behind. "What have you gotten yourself into this time, Arthur?" Edward muttered to himself before releasing a soft sigh and starting to walk towards the school once more. The closer he got, the more he gained information about the situation. Arthur was in from the thoughts of the different students who walked outside of the high school building. He was beaten up by Jacob? That shouldn't be possible. Arthur's physical abilities should be too high for Jacob to even have a chance. He confirmed it himself. Edward thought as a strange thought sprouted in his mind. However strange it was, the more Edward thought about it, the more convinced he was that it was what had actually happened. He clearly doesn't care much for anyone besides himself. So him letting Jacob beat him up because he couldn't return the punches out of feelings of friendship is out of the question. He clearly wasn't even friends with the boy to begin with. Edward thought as he continued walking through the hallways of Forks High School, meaning that he let himself get beaten up on purpose, and with how those rumors were being spread, as well as those thoughts from the other students. Edward thought before he felt it, an emotion that he hadn't experienced in a while, in a long, long while. He was both confused, shocked, and even slightly wary of a mere human. He managed to turn all the rumors against Jacob and bring his reputation up from the dredges to where it had been, at the top of the pedestal. It might even be higher than before. Edward thought as he finally arrived at the infirmary. Opening the door and walking inside, Edward was met with the sight of Arthur Moriarty sitting on a white bed whilst the school nurse was giving him a head pat. For a moment, Edward thought he had entered the wrong room. "Edward, you're here," Arthur said as he stood up, moving past the nurse and walking to the cold one who at this point was in a state of complete befuddlement, if he was being honest with himself. Arthur didn't mind his gaze at all as he turned to face the nurse, giving her a soft smile before saying, "Thank you for your help, miss. I really appreciate it." "Of course, Arthur. You can come by any time," the nurse replied, her smile twitching slightly as she looked at Edward. Arthur merely replied with a nod before turning around and heading out of the infirmary. Edward walks right behind him. "So the school nurse is into you?" Edward questioned after the two walked through the school hallway in silence for almost an entire minute. "Yes." Edward had expected a reply, however he hadn't expected one like this. At least he didn't expect a direct confirmation. He already knew the nurse had quite some thoughts about what she was going to do next to Arthur, if he hadn't arrived, however. "Aren't you too young?" Edward said as the two continued walking. "She's 30 at most. Alice is more than 100. I wonder which is worse." Arthur replied with a question in return. "That," and Edward was left stumped once more. Releasing a soft sigh, Arthur said after a few moments, "I don't have any feelings for her. At most I'm using her as a means to an end. I wanted her to make it seem as if the damage dealt to me was greater than it actually was." Arthur said as the two finally arrived at the front door of the school. "A means to an end? You're selling your body for something like this?" Edward asked in return, his brows furrowing as he practically glared at Arthur. "Who said I'm selling my body?" and merely making her think that this could lead to something after a while. That deranged woman thinks she already has me in complete control. She thinks that she's already groomed me enough so that I'm already guaranteed to love her and be her future boyfriend. Arthur replied before releasing a chuckle. It sounded quite weird when even his laugh was done in an almost monotone sound. Either way, everyone wants something from everyone else. However, whether you can actually gain what you want is completely up to your own abilities. And that woman doesn't even come close. Arthur said as the two walked through the parking lot. I see. I'd still suggest that Alice doesn't learn of this situation, however. We wouldn't want that woman to die, would we? Edward said as he used his key to remotely unlock the silver Volvo, it releasing a small beep as it signaled that the action had been performed successfully and that the car was now unlocked. Arthur merely gave Edward a nod in return before he opened the front passenger door and hopped inside the car. Edward opened the driver's seat instead and hopped in Oswell, after which he quickly closed the door after him and turned the ignition key, bringing the car's engine to life. With quick movements, he quickly reversed out of the school parking lot and started driving towards the Cullen mansion. Today had been rough for the vampire. He had met his mate, had almost killed said mate in his biology class, and then at the same time had just learned that his sister's mate could be less human than he outwardly looked. The drive towards the Cullen mansion was quiet. Both Edward and Arthur were inside of their own minds. At least Edward was. And his thoughts were exactly about Arthur at the moment. He couldn't sense any of Arthur's thoughts at all. It was blank. It wasn't as if he had some kind of barrier as his supposed mate had. No, it was more like there was nothing inside his mind, as if he was completely unconscious. Arthur, are you okay? Edward questioned as he continued driving. Yeah, I'm fine. Why do you ask? Arthur replied before questioning him on the sudden interest. Your head is as if it's completely blank. I thought you were unconscious for a moment, Edward replied. Arthur only gave a hum before replying. It seems to be working. Working? Edward questions in turn. I've been trying to find a way to make it so that you can't read my thoughts, and whilst it's not a great solution, it seems to be working. How? Edward asked once more, completely baffled at the fact that Arthur had managed to achieve it when no one, not even the vampires with their enhanced capabilities, had managed such a feat before Arthur. It's not that hard, though. It might have to do with me not being the average human. However, I seem to have a greater degree of control over my mind, and as such I simply am stopping myself from thinking about anything. And when I do think, I'm trying to increase the speed of my thoughts so that they wouldn't be able to be read by you, or at most they would seem like useless jargon, Arthur replied before releasing another slight hum. Whilst it looks like you guys have perfect memory and a great brain, that doesn't seem to correlate well with your telepathic powers. Maybe it is because your brain has to work more to turn the waves or whatever it is that others release so that you could read their mind. But that slight difference allows high-speed thoughts to escape your gift, Arthur said as he continued, giving a somewhat detailed description of how he had managed. I'd say that's certainly not something a regular human could do, Arthur, Edward said in return before the both of them returned to silence once more. What do you think about Bella? Arthur questioned a few minutes later. They were now about halfway to the mansion. I think she's lovely, and the attraction is certainly there, though she seems to be my bloodsinger as well, Edward said as he continued looking ahead. I see. Well, I think you should give her a chance. At least that way you will go at your own pace before she starts going crazy and doing things on her own. When that happens, it won't be under your control anymore, Arthur said in return. I don't want her to become like me, Arthur, Edward said, his voice slightly agitated. Become like you? A vampire? A monster in human skin? Arthur said in return, his voice as monotone as always, though even in that tone his words caused a reaction out of Edward. His grip on the steering wheel tightened whilst the car started speeding up. That's right, Arthur, Edward muttered, though it looked as if he was spitting the words out rather than voicing them. Then should I not be staying at your place? You were quite adamant about me coming with you to the mansion the other day, Edward. Should I stop seeing Alice? Arthur questioned in turn. That's different, Arthur. You're not exactly normal either, and your living conditions couldn't even be called living conditions. It's a miracle that you even managed to survive, Edward said in return, the agitation in his voice growing larger with each word that spewed out of his mouth. That's called double standards, Edward, and you know it. I had the ability to choose. whilst you were depriving her of that choice. So, I say you shut the fuck up about shit like this and get your act together. If not for yourself, then at least for her, the human who isn't a monster yet." Arthur replied before he turned his head away to look at the passing scenery outside of the car. Edward didn't speak further. However, Arthur could tell from just the tension inside the car that the guy hadn't taken his words great. In fact, he looked like he was about to destroy the steering wheel any second now. "How can you say that? Double standards? Arthur, you aren't human. You're nowhere near to what she is. She's a normal girl going to high school. She has parents. She has a house that's not falling apart. And she eats normally, just like every other human. She gets scared. She gets self-conscious about herself. She doesn't expel people out of the school as if she's a psychotic mastermind." Edward said. With each word, his voice got louder and louder, and by the end, the man was practically screaming at Arthur. Arthur simply listened before saying a single phrase. "You're just a cowardly bitch." Thankfully, by the time they had arrived at the Cullen mansion, or by how Edward was looking, they would have most likely crashed into the trees surrounding the road. Edward stopped the car quickly, causing Arthur to almost slam his head to the window next to him. Releasing a soft sigh, Arthur simply unbuckled his seat belt and got out after grabbing his backpack. Slamming the door closed, he turned around to face the front door of the mansion. Their small pixie was already waiting for him. Her face looked worried. "You're okay." "Yeah, I'm okay. Did you see a vision where our car crashed?" Arthur replied as he started walking towards her and the door, though it was mostly the latter that was his destination. "Yeah," Alice replied, her voice sounding almost meek, a complete opposite to her usually jolly tone of voice. "Edward was being a bitch, and I told him so, and in turn, he almost destroyed the steering wheel. Thankfully, we were close enough. Maybe you seeing that vision caused a butterfly effect or something of the sort, and the crash didn't happen," Arthur said in reply as he continued walking past her and into the mansion. Removing his shoes, he quickly placed them in a large shoe drawer and walked into the living room. Looking around, he quickly found the rest of the Cullens. Emmett was on the couch, playing on a Game Boy. Rosalie, Carlisle, and Jasper were watching a TV show, whilst Esme was in the kitchen getting dinner ready for Arthur from the looks of it. "Hello," Arthur said, giving the group a wave. "You're back, Arthur. I'm just about finished with the food. You can sit on the table," Esme said as her head peeked out of the kitchen to give Arthur a slight smile. "Okay, thank you." Arthur nodded in return before turning around and making some small talk with Carlisle, who asked him what his day at school had been like. After around a minute or so, Arthur gave the man a nod before heading to the dining table, Alice quickly following behind him as if she was a tail attached to Arthur's back. "You don't have to worry so much about me, Alice. I'll be fine," Arthur said as he sat down, turning his head to the left where Alice had already sat down before he could even notice her movements. "I'm not worrying too much, don't worry," Alice replied with a small wave of her hand. "So what were you and Edward talking about that made him so mad that he was about to destroy the steering wheel?" Alice questioned in the very next second. At her words, the rest of the family slightly turned their heads, clearly listening in on the conversation. "I just called him out," Arthur replied with a shrug as he crossed his arms. "I just called him out, though I'm sure you've already seen our discussion, have you not?" Arthur replied as he turned to face the pixie-like vampire. "I did, however, hearing it from you is better," Alice responded with a soft smile on her face, her lips only slightly climbing up. "Sigh." Releasing a soft sigh, Arthur gave a shallow nod before continuing to describe exactly what had happened during the drive to the mansion. The rest of the Cullens seemed pretty interested as well, and Arthur could notice their eyes and heads directly slightly in their direction. As he was about to finish the description of the events, Rosalie Hale interrupted him. "He's right, Arthur. You're too different from Bella for you to call it him having double standards." Arthur turned towards Rosalie and tilted his head slightly, giving her a questioning look. "And how am I so different, Rosalie? Are you actually asking me that?" Rosalie instead gave him a question of her own in response to releasing a frustrated huff. "You have senses that are clearly above human. Your mental prowess to just deal with everything thrown your way, and not bad eye isn't very human either, unless one's a psychopath. And that's just the start, Arthur. You managed to survive a frankly inhumane situation for years on end as a child. You've never even lived as a human to begin with. Rosalie said in turn, Is that so? But what if I wanted to live as a human? I had the choice to go through that route, and I would have succeeded even more easily than Bella ever could. Arthur said in reply to the woman, her eyes slightly scrunched together, clearly showing her dissatisfaction. You know that you're different, Arthur. You can't expect someone like Bella to be able to bear things that you find completely normal. For a moment, silence engulfed the entire room, the only sound being Arthur's breathing. It was only a few moments later that Arthur gave a shallow nod. I guess that's true. However, Edward should stick to one option then, though if this mate thing affects him as much as it does Alice, then it is already a done deal. It's like trying to stop an unstoppable tsunami. And from how he's acting, he's simply going to make things harder to Bella by acting irrationally. At the same time, the difference between her and me, which is more important, is that she feels the bond. Arthur replied as he got up from his seat, having already finished his meal. Turning toward Esme, he gave a nod. Thank you for the food. It was delicious. I'm glad. The woman replied with a smile on her face. It was at this moment that he heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Seems like Carlisle is home. I'll go ask him if we can get those tests started. I'm quite curious about the results, Arthur said as he started walking towards the front door. Alice followed behind him almost like a lost puppy once more. Alice, Arthur said before releasing a soft sigh and muttering under his breath. Never mind. It's not going to happen even if I ask. Alice's smile seemed to brighten as she replied in a mischievous tone. I'm glad that you're already getting the hang of it. Sure. With those words, Arthur and Alice arrived on the front porch just in time to see Carlisle getting out of his car. A 2003 BMW 5 Series. The man turned towards the two and raised an eyebrow before releasing a slight chuckle. It seems like you're quite excited about this as well, Arthur. That's right, Doctor. Arthur replied in a tone that made it seem like he was in fact the complete opposite of excited and curious. Carlisle gave a slight nod before taking his bag with him and walking towards the house. I procured some vials which we will fill with your blood to do some testing to see if your blood structure is any different from a regular human's. Besides that, we will also be doing an X-ray scan to see if your skeletal construct is different. Of course, testing the extent of your physical capabilities is on the list as well. Arthur gave a nod before asking, Where will you be taking my blood? As in what location will the process happen? I'm not very excited to see Alice go completely feral and turn me into a vampire quite so soon, if ever. Arthur said in turn, We will take the blood here as we can't really do in the forest. That would be quite a bit too unhygienic. This means that the others will have to go away for a few days until the smell of your blood fades away completely. Carlisle replied as he headed inside the mansion, Arthur and Alice following behind him. After greeting the rest of his family, Carlisle motioned for Arthur to follow him as he headed upstairs toward his office. Walking inside, Carlisle walked toward the left wall and quickly pressed a few buttons on a device of sorts. This in turn unlocked a hidden door of sorts that led into another part of his office. Alice already headed inside, Arthur following behind her whilst Carlisle walked behind him. The inside of the room was almost completely white, with the only contrast being the slight shades of gray that some machines were colored with and the shadows that these machines left after being shined upon by a completely colorless light. The smell similarly was quite intense, at least for Arthur. It was a similar smell that one would notice when inside of a hospital, however, it seemed to have been intensified multiple-fold. You certainly could open up an entire hospital with all these machines, Doctor. I like to stay on top of the medical field, Carlisle replied with a soft smile as he motioned for Arthur to walk towards a certain machine. Let's first get started with the X-ray of your body. It is still a work in progress. I try to get the best new technological inventions to keep up with the times, Carlisle replies as he points toward a machine to the left. Do I just stand behind it? Arthur asks as he walks towards the machine. Yes, change into these first. However, Carlisle says as he hands a blue medical cloth. Giving a slight nod, Arthur walked behind the machine cover and changed into the cloth he was given. I'm ready. All right, just stand there. Should be done in a few seconds, Carlisle replies as he starts typing on a keyboard before the monitor next to the machine. A few seconds later, the process is complete. All right, it's done. You can wear your clothes again, Carlisle says as he looks at the monitor in front of him, where an X-ray image of Arthur's body could be seen in black and white. A few moments later, Arthur joined him, now dressed in his clothes once more. So, are there any clear differences? Arthur asks curiously as he looks at the monitor, though from what he could see, the bone structure looked to be the same. No, there are no differences between your bone structure and that of a regular human. That likely means that it's only the physical toughness of your bones that is stronger than a regular human. We would have to take a part of your bone and study it to be for sure. Carlisle replies as he closes the monitor screen. Next, is blood correct? Arthur asks with a nod. Yes, for the next part, we're heading to the room over there. It's completely sealed and will stop any of the scent from escaping. This way Alice won't go feral. Carlisle replies in his usual soft voice as he points to a door on the right side of the room. Alice, who had stayed silent until now, walked outside the office. Arthur, meanwhile, looked at the door. Unlike the rest of the doors in the house, this one was metallic and clearly looked to be at least bulletproof. How did you manage to get this installed in here? Wouldn't the contractors or other people ask questions? Arthur asked curiously as he walked inside the room. The inside was completely padded by some kind of material that Alex couldn't identify, and the room was quite small with only a small desk in the middle. I bought the door itself in another country and transported it here myself. It took a while for me to get proficient and learn how to complete the room, however, if nothing else. I do have time, Carlisle replied with a soft smile as he closed the door behind him. An audible wishing sound was heard as the door locked. Please sit on the desk, Carlisle said as he started taking out 3 clean vials. Arthur gave a nod as he walked to the desk and sat down before rolling up his sleeve and showing his forearm. Carlisle merely gave a nod and didn't wait any further as he took the blood and filled the vials. Does blood truly not affect you at all? Arthur asked curiously as he watched the man. It does affect me, however, I have learned to control my impulses. I have a lot more practice than the others, you could say. However, I also have a theory that a person's mental state and desires as a human matter a lot for when they become a vampire. That could be another reason. Carlisle replies as he caps the vials. Are we done? How are you even going to inspect the blood? You'll have to take it out of the vials, and the others would be able to clearly catch its scent. Arthur asks curiously. I'll be inspecting it in the city hospital rather than here, at least most of it. For the final part, I'll have to use the machines here. However, I can simply do it when the others go on for a hunt and aren't close by. Carlisle replies as he opens the bulletproof door, another wishing sound being heard as the airlock releases and the two head outside the room. Interesting. I'm quite curious to see if there is any change in the blood structure. Maybe an overall increase in blood cells? Or some kind of anomaly in them, Arthur said as he walked to sit on the couch inside the office. I am as well. I've never actually seen human with your capabilities, to say the least, Carlisle replies as he puts the blood-filled vials inside suitcase. You may head on now. We are done for now. The testing of your physical capabilities will be done at a later date. Carlisle says softly as he nods towards the door. All right. See you later, Doctor. Arthur replies with a nod as he walks towards the door and heads outside. Walking downstairs back into the living room, Arthur met with the rest of the Cullens once more. Edward is there as well this time, sitting on the couch next to Jasper and Emmett. Seems like you've calmed down, Arthur says as blunt and bland in this tone, as always as he moves to sit on the couch opposite the 3 of them. Alice, who had been with him in the office but had walked outside silently when the blood test had been done, finally spoke again as she sat next to him on the couch. Your regeneration is also higher than a regular human's. I don't smell any blood on you, even though you were pierced by the needle, Alice says with her curious, almost hyperactive voice. That is probably the case. I don't really remember really having sores or any lasting wounds in my life, Arthur replies with a soft nod. Edward, who had been watching him until now, silently finally speaks once more. It's clear from his tone of voice that the man was still agitated by Arthur's earlier words. However, he was maintaining his calmness. What do you propose that I do about this mate bond, then, Arthur? Arthur turns his head to give him a look before saying bluntly, simply accept it. It's not something you have the capability to run from, at least from how attached Alice seems to have become with me. And if it's on the same level for you, then it can't be helped. Arthur replies calmly as always. Your main problem isn't with Bella or what her circumstances are. It's with the fact that you perceive yourself as a monster and not a real person. That's the main problem that you need to find a solution to. Your main problem isn't with Bella or what her circumstances are. It's with the fact that you perceive yourself as a monster and not a real person. That's the main problem that you need to find a solution to. Arthur says as he looks at Edward in the eyes. His own is always unshaken and unflinching. The room went quiet, impossibly so. The only sound being heard was the insects outside in the forest and the sound of Arthur breathing. The other vampires had gone completely still as they waited for Edward's reaction, perhaps his outburst. Alice was already getting ready to jump in at any moment as she waited patiently, her muscles triggered for any sign of danger towards Arthur. The silence was broken when Edward released a soft, tired sigh. "You're right. That's true," he said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. A regular human would have most likely missed it entirely. Monsters, it's a term created by humans, but at the end of the day, it's just bullshit, Arthur said in his usual bland tone. First of all, aren't humans just animals as well? Then what do you think other animals perceive them as? Humans destroy ecosystems and devour and eat other animals. Aren't they monsters too? Arthur asks, but it's a rhetorical question that he didn't expect an answer to. At the end of the day, vampires are just predators, just like humans are and just like lions are. They simply stand higher in the food chain. It's a basic part of life, not something you should hate yourself for. Arthur continues calmly as he looks at Edward. That's quite a simple way to put it, but you aren't wrong. Jasper speaks for the first time in what felt like ever, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. I just wanted to ponder over that. Take your time, Edward, but do come up with an answer soon. Arthur said calmly as he got up from the couch. Is there any food in the fridge, ma'am? Arthur asks respectfully as he turns to Esme Cullen. Yes. The woman replies almost instantly with a soft-spoken voice and smile as she gets up hurriedly to move to the kitchen. I actually made some earlier. I tried making egg fried rice and chicken tenders. That sounds perfect. Thank you. Arthur replies with a soft nod of appreciation. It's tomorrow morning. The group of vampire students arrived at the parking lot in front of Forks High School, early as always as they stood around their cars. Arthur, the only human of the group, stood next to Alice, who was excitedly babbling on about a new line of fashion that had just been announced recently. Clothes are just that, clothes. Why you get so excited about them is something baffling to me. Arthur says with a shrug of his shoulders. You can't say that. I'll have to take you on a shopping trip, and then you will find the essence to appreciate clothing and fashion. Alice says almost instantly, her head already filled with hundreds of thoughts that instantly caused Edward to grunt. Being next to her must be quite the pain for a telepath, Arthur says as he gives a side glance to the man. It is, frankly, the easiest people to be around are you and Jasper. Not a lot of thoughts, and those that are there aren't forced or aggravating, but more soft in a way. Edward replies. It's at this moment that the loud, barely working orange truck of Bella Swan parks itself on the other side of the parking lot by the road. She's here. What are you going to do? Arthur asks as he looks at the truck with faint curiosity in his eyes. I'll be talking to her today, Edward replies, causing the rest of the Cullens to widen their eyes slightly. Gotten past the emo phase already? Arthur asks jokingly, though his bland, almost emotionless tone makes him sound almost like he's just asking a regular question and not teasing about it. You need to work on your voice, Edward replies with a deadpan. It is at this moment, as they are gazing at Bella Swan, that she turns her head towards them. Simultaneously at the same time, a loud screeching sound and a horn are heard as a white minivan loses control on the road and starts heading toward Bella at high speeds. Arthur sees it happen in an instant, his vision catching Edward as the vampire runs toward Bella at speeds a human I wouldn't even be able to perceive. He's fast, much, much faster than I am. Arthur thinks to himself as he sees Edward grab Bella with one hand while stopping the van with his other. He sees Edward's hand pushing against the metal of the van, clearly leaving a hand imprint on it as the van finally stops a moment later. It all happens in an instant as the surrounding people finally react. Screaming is heard as people rush towards the incident scene. Well, this just got a lot more annoying. Arthur mumbles as he starts walking towards the incident site. Why didn't you stop this? I'm sure you've seen it happen. Arthur asks Alice as the two walk together calmly. Emmett, Rosalie, and Jasper follow behind them. I don't know what you mean. I don't see everything that happens, Alice says with a steadfast tone. Sure, Arthur replies with his own bland voice as they finally reach there, seeing Edward still holding Bella on the floor, and people had already called emergency services. Are you hurt, Edward? Arthur asks, simply to keep up appearances as he crouches next to him. I'm fine, thank you, Edward replies before finally noticing Arthur pointing to the indent on the car with his eyes. A small imperceptible nod later, and a hidden swipe of Edward's hand, and the hand indent changes shape to appear like a normal random indent. Good. The ambulance should be here soon. Though you both appear to be fine, you should go to the hospital just in case, Arthur says, and Alice, who's next to him, instantly nods. She most definitely saw all of us on the other side of the parking lot. She's going to want answers. Edward, are you going to give them? Arthur thinks as he looks at Edward. Edward gives a slight shake of his head, his eyes growing colder as he looks at Arthur, clearly warning him to stay silent. Don't worry, don't plan on dealing with this. It's not my problem after all. You do you. Arthur thinks as he raises his hands slightly in surrender and turns around and waits. A few minutes later, an ambulance car is seen turning the corner at the end of the road and heading to the scene of the accident quickly before stopping right in front. Paramedics quickly rushed out towards Bella and Tyler Crowley, the boy who had been driving the white van that had skidded off course towards Bella. The situation was handled quickly once they found no visible injuries that were of major concern on Bella. However, Tyler was handled with a bit more care as he seemed to have sprained his neck on the impact. You coming with Arthur? Alice asks as she starts walking towards the car, the rest of the Cullens together with her. To the hospital? I don't think there's any need for me to be there. I'd just be skipping classes. I'd rather keep my perfect attendance record. Arthur replies as he waves at the group and starts heading back towards the high school building. Alice gave a soft shake of her head and a soft sigh as she turned around and headed towards the car. He certainly is nonchalant, Emmett said with a chuckle as he walked next to her. Well, from what we've seen of him, I'd say he's acting perfectly in character, Rosalie muttered next to him, coldly, as always as they all hopped into their cars. 5 hours later, Arthur walked out of the school gates, having finished his classes, his backpack slung over one arm as he walked. I wonder how I'll get home now. They didn't forget to come pick me up, did they? Arthur mumbled as he walked into the parking lot. No, I didn't. I'd never forget Arthur, Alice said as she appeared next to him, practically jumping to his side with a smile. Yeah, Arthur asked blandly as he walked towards the Volvo. Took Edward's car? Yeah. Taking my Porsche really isn't a great idea if one wants to stay inconspicuous, Alice replied. Her mood as always was through the roof as she unlocked the car and headed towards the driver's side. Right, yet you still drive it around like a madman. If you got caught by the police, that would blow your cover, wouldn't it? Arthur asked in turn as he opened the passenger door and sat inside, before closing it behind him and slinging the backpack onto the back seats. I can see the future, Alex. That stuff is easy enough to avoid, Alice said with a giggle as she turned the ignition key and started the car before driving off the parking lot. And yet you say that you don't see everything. What exactly was your reason for not stopping today's accident from happening? Arthur asked as he tilted his head. Well, let's just say I'm in favor of Edward and Bella being together. And from what I've seen, Bella's going to be quite the great friend to me, Alice replied with a large smile. Acting like a match marker. Don't you have other stuff to do? Like go shopping or whatever it is that you do in your free time? Arthur asked blandly as he looked outside the window at the passing tree line. Well, that does get boring after a few decades. And making sure that Edward goes out of his emo phase, as you call it, would certainly make for a more interesting free time, don't you think? Alice asked with a soft giggle as she slammed the gas pedal harder. My life is too precious. Slow down. And as for Edward, don't think he's ever getting past emo, even if he were to get married. I'm afraid you'll have to suffer for eternity. Arthur replied bluntly. Alice laughed as she took her foot off the pedal. You're totally right, but still it's worth a shot. And I think someone like Bella would have a good effect on the old emo. Alice replied as she took a sharp corner. Yeah? Make him understand that he's not a monster. Arthur questioned as he turned the radio on to listen to whatever music was being streamed on the station at the moment. Classical? Who even listens to this shit? Arthur mumbled as he turned it off entirely. Edward does, from what I saw from my visions. Bella does too, Alice said with a giggle. Great, two old classical lovers. Perfect for each other. I think they're just going to make each other worse at this point. Arthur mumbled. You're right about that. I don't get why people still like that stuff. It was boring a few decades ago, not to mention now, Alice said with a laugh. Anyways, when are you planning on that shopping trip? A few new pairs of clothes would certainly be appreciated. Though, normal clothes, not the designer ones that you try to get me to wear every day. Arthur said with a sigh as he turned to look outside the window once more. They were getting close to the Cullen mansion at this point. Well, we could go tonight if you want. I'd like that. Our first proper date, just the two of us. It'll be lovely, Alice said with a soft smile, a rarity for the usual overjoyous ADHD girl. I've accepted this bond or mate vampire thing. However, I do have to remind you that I don't particularly feel anything. So I'd suggest you keep your hopes low, Alice, Arthur said bluntly in his usual bland tone. Don't worry, I'll crack that emotionless mask quick enough, Alice said with a giggle and a wink as she practically drifted into the Cullen mansion driveway. Your driving is going to result in my death. I'm a master at this, Alice replied instantly as she stopped the car before the garage and turned the ignition off. Heading inside the Cullen mansion, Arthur was met with the sight of the entire Cullen coven sitting around the living room sofa. Edward was sitting at the far end of the right couch, looking more depressed than usual. Jasper was sitting next to him, likely calming him down. Arthur thought to himself as he turned to the rest of the Cullen who were spread around on the two other couches. Quite the depressing mood. Arthur blurted out, as usual with no filter at all to his speech. Blunt as usual, Emmett said with a laugh. Well, what happened? Did Bella Swan ask about how a certain someone ran at supernatural speeds and then proceeded to stop a moving van with one hand? Arthur asked as he walked and sat down on the couch opposite Edward and Jasper, next to Emmett and Rosalie. Alice quickly followed him and sat right next to him, practically glued to his side. She did. I say we kill her, however, someone clearly isn't fond of the idea. Rosalie replied coldly. Isn't that going a bit too far? Arthur asked as he turned to look at the blonde vampire. She could say something. That would put all of us in danger, you included, Arthur. I frankly don't think so. If this was the 1600s, then maybe, since people used to believe in the supernatural with all the witch hunts and all that. But nowadays, at most what she could achieve will be getting people to think she's batshit insane. Arthur replied with a bald tone, shrugging his shoulders. That certainly is a big possibility. However, the problem isn't the humans knowing that she knows. It's the fact that a vampire could hear her at that point. We'd all be in danger because of her. Carlyle replied in that usual soft voice of his, yet this time it was actually more serious than Arthur had ever heard him be until now. I see. I guess I only thought of it from the human side. So then, what are you planning on doing? Edward clearly doesn't want her dead. She's his soul mate or whatever. So either turn her or move away or somehow find a way to get her to keep her mouth shut. This last option could include silencing her forever. Arthur said calmly, his voice not wavering at all even as he spoke about killing Bella. It was like he was simply remarking about the weather. Do you not feel anything at all? How can you just talk about killing a human so easily? You're a human yourself, Arthur. Edward interjected as he shot a scathing glare at Arthur. I'm simply analyzing the situation that you've put us in, Edward. Do you have any better ideas? Arthur questioned as he raised an eyebrow. No, Edward replied softly with a sigh. Killing her isn't necessary. I'd say we wait for a few weeks and see how she reacts if she doesn't speak of it. Well, we just act like nothing happened and continue. If she does, we move to Alaska at the Denali for the next few decades. Carlyle announces. Sounds like a plan. Either way, Alice and I are going out for the night. Do you want us to buy you something? Arthur replied as he got up, walking towards the staircase. I'd appreciate it if you bought me that new release of my cookbook that I usually use, Esme said softly with a gentle smile. All right, let's go get you changed out of your school clothes first. Alice replied as she quickly got up, a smile on her face as she skipped after Arthur. I'll be changing on my own. I don't plan on wasting my next 2 hours in the closet, Arthur said with a deadpan as he walked up the stairs towards his room. Don't you have any sexual libido at all? Imagine it. Me with you in the closet together, Alice said with a wink. First of all, everyone heard that I'd appreciate you not saying stuff like that with all the vampires around. Second, I don't think I do. I think my body still hasn't completely left survival mode after years of having to ration every drop of food. It isn't really in the mood or situation until now to even think about reproduction capabilities. Arthur replied as he headed inside his room and locked the door. A groan could be heard from outside as Alice stomped her foot in annoyance, causing the floorboards to crack slightly. Scary woman, cracking the damn floor. Arthur thought to himself. Around 5 minutes later, he walked outside, wearing a simple pair of black jeans, a black shirt, and a baseball cap, having been too lazy to style his hair. The cap because you couldn't be bothered with your hair, Alice said instantly as soon as she saw him, her face holding a deadpan expression. Correct, Arthur replied bluntly as he walked downstairs and out of the house towards the garage. We're taking the Porsche. Forks doesn't have anything or any good stores. We're going to have to head to Port Angeles, Alice announced as she ran towards the yellow Porsche. Great. Now she's got more horsepower to squash me in a tree together with, Arthur mumbled as he followed behind her. Getting inside the car, Arthur instantly buckled himself at the belt before closing the door behind him as Alice giggled at him. You're such a coward sometimes, live a little. Coward? More like a survivalist. Sure, whatever you say, she replies with a laugh before turning the ignition key and reversing out of the mansion garage and onto the driveway before changing gears and slamming the gas pedal, launching the car ahead. Minutes passed in silence. Arthur wasn't one to make small talk usually, and Alice seemed too caught up in her own mind to say anything. It was at this moment, as they were driving through the tree-dense forest road, that Alice's head suddenly lolled to the side. Her eyes glazed over. What the fuck? Arthur blurted instantly as he grabbed the steering wheel and started directing the car. Wake the fuck up, wake up. Arthur practically screamed, however Alice stayed in the same state. For 20 seconds, all Arthur could think was that he was fucked, utterly fucked. I knew this was going to happen. I should always trust my fucking instincts, he thought darkly. It was at this moment that Alice's eyes rolled back down and her body grew rigid. Her face looked haunted. Fuck, we have to go back, right this second, Alice announced as she slammed the brakes. Why? What did you see? Rosalie. She's going to kill Bella. Rosalie. She's going to kill Bella, Alice said as she slammed the brakes on the Porsche. The car, which had been going at high speeds, started swerving right and left, leaving marks on the asphalt as it came to a quick stop. Changing the gear quickly, Alice changed directions before slamming the gas and driving back towards the mansion. Where? How? What even happened? Arthur asked curiously as he looked at Alice with a confused expression that showed even though his face was usually deadpan. This never happened. Just what is going on? Is it because of something I said? Arthur thought to himself as he saw the serious expression on Alice's face as she drove at insane speeds, taking each turn with only an inch to spare, pushing the Porsche to its mechanical limits. Stop, get out, and run. I'll come back with the car. That'll be faster, Arthur said suddenly as his mind whirled, trying to form any ideas on what was happening and how to fix it. However, he came up blank beside this. He had no information or idea whatsoever. Right, Alice said as she slammed the brakes once more and stopped the car before practically jumping out of the car. She disappeared in a blur of movement, much faster than the Porsche, running towards the Cullen mansion. Getting out of the passenger seat, Arthur quickly slid onto the driver one before starting the car and driving once more, this time at a much slower pace than what Alice had been at. This was always a possibility. In the books, everything turned out great because it was just that, a mere book, a work of fiction. This is reality. Rosalie could likely think that Bella is simply far too large of a danger to the Cullens and decided to kill her. However, Rosalie already knows that Alice can see the future. So, did she make a split-second decision? Did she think far ahead enough to make a way to counter Alice's visions? Arthur mumbled to himself as he drove the Porsche. Around 20 minutes later, he arrived at the Cullen mansion and parked the car in the garage before heading out and walking up the stairs and into the modern mansion. Walking inside, he was met with the sight of a snarling Edward sitting next to Bella Swan on the left couch, whilst Rosalie, Jasper, and Emmett sat on the opposite couch. Carlisle and Esme Cullen were standing whilst Alice was seated on a chair at the dining table. "So what's happening?" Arthur asked with a deadpan as he grabbed a chair, and sat next to Alice. "Getting close to Edward right now is a suicide wish. There's no way I'm sitting on that couch." Arthur thought to himself as he looked at the scene in front of him. Rosalie decided that it was a good idea to kill Bella. Edward snarled. His usual bronze eyes were pitch black, clearly almost at a feral point. "She is a danger. You either turn her or she dies. Choose Edward," Rosalie said in her cold voice. Her eyes, however, were even colder than her tone, like glaciers. "How about we all calm down and talk about this?" Esme said softly as she raised her hands in a placating manner. "I support Rosalie in this decision." Jasper Hale spoke up. His voice was much deeper than usual, as if he was in immense pain as he spoke. "He's barely holding himself together at this point. Bella's blood this close, and the raging emotions around him, especially Edward's." Arthur thought as he looked at the blonde-haired man sitting stiffly beside Rosalie. "What do you think, Alice?" Arthur asked as he tilted his head towards her. "I think that Bella should be able to choose, and that death shouldn't be the only other option." Her voice was soft, but there was an undeniable stiffness to it, and it didn't carry her usual jovial tone at all. "I'm with Rosalie on this one as well," Emmett announced next, his booming voice resounding around the living room of the mansion. "What exactly was your plan, Rosalie?" Arthur asked curiously as he turned his gaze toward the impossibly beautiful vampire. "It was going to be easy, snapping her neck. It would have been painless, instant," Rosalie replied coldly. "Then why have you not killed me yet? Whilst I'm not a regular human, I still smell like one. Wouldn't I put you at the same risk as her?" Arthur asked curiously in turn. "You're already confirmed to turn into one of us, Arthur. You've been living with us." She, however, has kept asking questions, kept trying to learn what she should not. Rosalie replied with a snarl. Arthur released a soft hum before nodding his head. "All right, I'm actually in favor of turning her. It just lowers all the complications." Arthur replied after a moment of thought. His voice is bland, as usual, however his words caused a shock to go through the room. Alice beside him stiffened completely. She didn't move at all like a rock. Edward on the other side practically vibrated with rage as he turned his gaze towards Arthur. Bella, who had been next to him, looked like she was choking on her breaths. "You don't get to decide for her," Edward said in an almost emotionless yet feral voice. It was jarring, utterly inhumane. "He doesn't decide for her, however you also can't decide something that endangers everyone simply because of your feelings, Edward," Carlisle replied with a soft sigh as he ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated with how the situation was developing. "I don't get the reason as to why everyone is so against turning her into a vampire," Arthur said as he turned his glacial blue eyes toward Carlisle. "Because it means giving up on your current life completely. It means potentially never being able to even see your parents again, not to mention talking to them," Esme replied softly, her voice tender as always. "This is bullshit. It wasn't even my fault that he revealed himself. He could have just left me there, and I probably wouldn't have even died." Bella finally spoke. Her voice choked. She clearly looked stressed, however, at the same time she was furious. "What could have or could not have been isn't really important right now, Bella. So I'd suggest you choose." Arthur replies blandly. "You're a human. You don't get to talk. Why can you remain one and know about this whilst I have to choose either dying or losing everyone I know?" Bella says, her voice tearing through her throat as tears streamed down her face, her hands shaking as she put them on her thighs to stop. However, it was hard if not impossible. "Because I'm not really your go-off-the-mill human, however I do get what you mean, as I said earlier. However, it just hasn't come up yet. I wouldn't really mind becoming a vampire. The most annoying thing is the fact that I wouldn't be able to go out into the sun in public unless I wanted to become a disco ball. However, everything else really is only a bonus for me." Arthur replied in that same blunt, emotionless tone that whilst the Cullens had become used to, Bella certainly wasn't, as she looked at him in what looked pretty close like hatred. "You're being illogical, Bella. This isn't my fault. If it's someone's fault, it's Edward. And even then you can't really judge the man considering he did save your life. So your parents would have lost you either way. At least in this scenario, you're alive. Look at this positively," Arthur said as he looked at her, tilting his head slightly. Confusion could be seen in his expression. It's not that easy," Bella replied as he turned her gaze away to look at the ground. "I won't let you force her. I'll fight if I have to. She doesn't have to become a monster," Edward said suddenly, his gaze turning even more ferocious than before as he got up on his feet. "Edward, stand down," Rosalie said as she instantly got on her feet as well, snarling ferally at her adopted brother. For a moment, all that could be heard was the snarling and feral hissing of the two vampires, who now resembled wild beasts much more than they did humans. Alice had already gotten up at this point and was standing protectively in front of Arthur. "Well, that went great," Arthur mumbled blandly as he gazed at the two. Time seemed to slow for a single moment in front of Arthur's eyes as he saw both Rosalie and Edward move towards each other at superhuman speeds. It all happened in less than a second. One moment Edward was about to hold Rosalie by the neck. The next Emmett was punching his stomach, and Jasper was holding back Rosalie. Meanwhile, Alice was still standing protectively in front of him, whilst Esme and Carlyle stood to the side. It all happened in a flash, and by the time Arthur's brain had finished computing the details that his eyes had taken in at speeds beyond regular human perception, the conflict had already ended. Edward was smashed against the wall whilst Bella stood frozen. Jasper was holding Rosalie whilst Emmett stood in the middle. Edward released an inhuman growl as he became a blur once more and appeared next to Bella, grabbing her before vanishing as he ran away and out of the house. His speed was much faster than all the other Cullens and Hale, who didn't even try to go after him. Is he running away with her? What is that dumbass thinking now? Arthur mumbled to himself curiously as he raised an eyebrow, whilst the rest of his expression remained a firm deadpan. "He is," Alice replied, her voice serious as she stood next to Arthur. "Right, so he's taking her away from her family either way. He's doing the same thing, but at least this time, she isn't becoming a vampire. He's not doing it for her. He's doing it for himself because he can't bear becoming a part of the reason that makes her a vampire. He's acting selfishly, even if it looks selfless perhaps from Bella's view," Arthur said bluntly, not mincing his words at all as he walked to the couch and sat down. "What will you guys be doing?" Arthur asked as he turned his gaze towards Rosalie and the rest. "I'll be going to get rid of her and take him back," Rosalie replied instantly. "No, killing her isn't the choice, Rosalie. It's better if we just turn her. This way Edward actually returns. Otherwise it would just be a fight to the death." Carlyle spoke up at this moment, his expression as soft as always, just like his voice. It was as if nothing that had just happened had affected his calm demeanor at all. "We're going right now?" Arthur asked curiously as he turned toward Carlyle. "Yes, you can stay here, Arthur. It will be dangerous. We can't really promise that Edward won't attack you if something goes wrong." Carlyle replied softly. "No, I'll come, and if it's hunting, I'm pretty good myself. My sense of smell is good enough that I'll be able to detect her if she's in a few miles' range of me," Arthur replied as he got up, his blue eyes seeming to grow slightly colder as if frost was covering them. He turned to gaze outside the long windows of the mansion. "All right, Alice and Arthur together. Go check out Port Angeles. Rosalie and Emmett, go check up on Alaska. Jasper, Esme, and I will check the area around Forks in the mountains," Carlyle announced, causing the group to give a round of nods. "Alice and I, because we are mates, similar reason for Rosalie and Emmett, and he put Jasper with himself, and Esme, because he has the least control over his bloodlust, whilst he and Esme are one of the best at controlling their cravings. At the same time, he chose Forks as the area of the search for them, which is the least likely area for Bella and Edward to be in considering we are hunting them." Arthur thought to himself as he gave a nod of appreciation to the man. Quick thinking, he got up and headed outside the mansion towards the Porsche with Alice once more. Let the hunt begin, Arthur thought. The drive to Port Angeles didn't take long. It was only a 40-minute drive with Alice behind the wheel. Arriving at the town, Arthur looked around, noticing that the city was indeed much more populated and developed. "Did you check if there was any sunlight out today or tomorrow here?" Arthur asked Alice as she parked the Porsche near a parking lot at the center plaza of the city. "Yes, the forecast didn't show anything, and something like that I could predict as well," Alice replied. Her tone was serious. She clearly wasn't in a mood. "Right. All right then, you check the edges of the city, as well as the west and north, whilst I'll check around the east and south sides," Arthur replied with a quick nod as he opened the car door and headed outside, walking at a fast pace but not running. His job was to find the two, not to actually interact with Bella or Edward. That's a death wish. Edward will obviously protect his mate over me. If this goes badly, he could even end up killing me, though I should be able to at least avoid him and get to a populated area before he does, after which I should be safe. Even he knows well enough to not attack me anywhere near humans or cameras, Arthur thought to himself. As he did, he kept doing it at an impossible rate for regular humans, so as for Edward to not be able to hear these thoughts and for him to find his location. Even then, he usually blocks out most of the thoughts from his mind so that he doesn't get overwhelmed by them. But at this point, he's in a fight or flight state. He's likely concentrating on all of them at the same time, even at the cost of stamina. Arthur thought as he kept looking around, his eyes moving at quick speeds as he scanned the faces of all the people near him. What he was doing was quite costly on his mental, however it had to be done. But even that wasn't just what he was doing. Walking to the middle of the plaza, he sat down on a nearby bench and closed his eyes. Concentrating entirely on his sense of smell, it quickly got enhanced to beyond superhuman levels. Vampires have an easy smell to differentiate. It's close to corpses, and the smell of blood is always on their bodies. What I need to do now is to differentiate the vampires. There are two different conditions that I need to apply, but the main one is that I need to differentiate between animal and human blood. If I mistakenly follow a vampire and they have human blood on them, that's not the Cullens. That's a straight death wish. Thankfully, animal blood and human blood can be differentiated with smell, at least when I concentrate. And next, I need to ignore any smells from the west and north, as well as those too far away. Arthur thought quickly as he focused even more. Nothing wait there, on the far south, almost at the edge of the city. Arthur thought as he turned his head towards the south. The smell in his mind felt like a trail that led in that direction. It was as if a blazing red path was opened inside his mind, leading him straight towards the target. I can't really tell if there is a human near there, or more specifically Bella. However, at this point, I have to simply go for it. Arthur thought as he released a soft sigh and opened his eyes. They were shining blue almost eerily as he got up and started walking in that direction, whilst at the same time, he grabbed his old phone that Alice had bought for him. "Alice, I might have found a vampire. I think it's Edward, however, I'm not 100% sure." Arthur spoke into the phone as soon as the call was picked up. "I just got called by Carlisle. Edward and Bella were found by them," Alice replied over the phone. "What? Then who?" Arthur mumbled confusedly before his eyes widened. The smell of the vampire he had caught was coming in his direction, and it was coming quickly. I might be getting attacked by a rogue vampire. They smell animal blood, however, so they might be a vegetarian. I don't have any idea how they realized I had locked onto them. I'm in the south side of the city already. Arthur quickly spoke into the phone before shutting the call and throwing the phone into an alley. At the same time, he quickly removed his upper clothes, ran towards a building, and started parkouring up quickly before throwing the shirt onto the balcony of an apartment, and then using the side railing of the building to slide back down and starting to run through an alley, his steps silent as the wind as he did. Parkouring through a few different roadblocks and walls, he quickly arrived around 100 meters away from his previous location before he parkoured up another building and into a balcony that had its door open. Heading inside the apartment silently, he quickly crouched, hiding from the gaze of a man and woman who were talking in what looked like the kitchen. Sneaking around, he quickly walked behind the couch, sliding in between it and the wall before staying utterly still. Even his breathing was slowed to the point that a regular human would have already started suffocating, whilst his heart rate fell down to almost impossibly slow beats, barely alive. There's a couple of different ways that he could have noticed me, but it is most certainly a vampire gift. The question is just what it is. Is it something similar to Alice, or is it something like instinct? An enhanced instinct would allow him to know the general direction as well as the fact that he was being tracked, and that would make sense since he wasn't actually coming directly in my direction, but that is still too vague. I have close to no information on the vampire besides the animal smell coming from them and the fact that they most definitely have a gift. I threw away my phone and shirt so that if he had a smelling or tracking gift, he would be thrown off. However, that would make no sense since smelling me wouldn't make him realize that I started tracking him. Arthur thought as he felt a headache starting to come at the situation he had found himself in. It was at this moment that a pair of footsteps were heard on the balcony. "Ah, fuck," Arthur thought to himself. "Ah, fuck," Arthur thought to himself as soon as he heard the soft footsteps coming from the balcony. He knew for sure that it wasn't the two humans in the apartment. They were still in the kitchen, unaware of the fact that two strangers had just come inside their home. This is bad. I don't really want to be the cause of the death of two humans. However, this was the best way I could find of hiding. Kazuo thought to himself as he instantly moved. He knew there was no reason to stay still behind the couch anymore. A cold one or a vampire had good enough hearing that they would even hear his heartbeat at this close of a range. What I need to do now is stall for time before Alice comes and finds me. She should be able to at least do that much with her future sight gift. Arthur thought to himself as he instantly raised his body and positioned himself closer to the large windows next to him. Looking at the balcony, he saw them. A pale, chalky white man with short black hair and bronze-colored eyes. "I was wondering, why are you chasing me?" Arthur asked as he looked at the man who was now directly gazing at him. His body still as a rock, still beyond any natural means, clearly supernatural in the way he held himself. The man simply tilted his head lightly to the side before releasing a soft, amused chuckle, though it was clear that the amusement didn't reach his eyes as he gazed at Arthur. "Wouldn't it be more appropriate if I asked you that question?" The man questioned. His voice was a deep, almost unnatural baritone. Though it was clearly attractive, something all cold ones were, it was a way of hunting after all, and these creatures were just that, predators of humans. I need to make him believe that I'm not human, but rather some kind of supernatural creature. That shouldn't be hard considering that he sensed when I was tracking him from hundreds of meters away. However, that also poses the risk of him taking me with him simply for the fact that not a human or anything that was ever seen before, but that's a risk I'll have to take. In comparison, he could actually kill me if he believes I'm a human who knows the secret about the vampires. Arthur thought to himself as he gazed at the man. In the outside world, only a mere split second had passed, however, inside his mind. Arthur felt like minutes had as he tried and analyzed all the possible reactions and actions he could take from this point. "I was looking for a friend of mine. They're a vegetarian cold one, as you seem to be. I mistook your smell for theirs." Arthur finally spoke, his voice soft and calm, despite the position he had found himself in. "I'd prefer we left before the humans here realized we were in their house. I wouldn't want them dead." Arthur spoke once again as he turned his gaze towards the two unknowing humans merely meters away from them, still arguing with each other about how they should be making their dinner tonight. "All right, follow me to the rooftop," the cold one said, and in a blur of motion, disappeared outside the apartment. Arthur had no choice but to follow behind him. He knew that physically he couldn't outrun one, and he wasn't even able to hide from this one, as it seemed to have some kind of special gift related to tracking and location. Could it be a gift that notifies its users the moment they're being tracked and shows them where the tracker is? That could be possible. Arthur thought to himself as he stealthily arrived outside the balcony without disturbing the humans before latching onto the wall and quickly starting to climb up with superhuman ease. It didn't take longer than 10 seconds for him to climb up all the way to the rooftop before swinging his body over the ledge and standing on top of it. There, sitting down on the ledge, to his right was the vampire who was looking at him coldly. "Do we have a problem?" "I say we simply ignore each other, since this was a mistake, and continue in our own way. Clearly, your diet isn't human or anything humanoid, so we shouldn't really have any reason to go against one another." Arthur spoke, his voice calm, yet his hand was slightly clenched behind his back. "The problem is that whilst your abilities clearly are above those of humans, you smell just like one, and I've seen humans with gifts before, superhuman abilities. And humans aren't supposed to know of our existence. The man spoke as a smile appeared on his face. Logical, my abilities could technically just be some kind of gift, just like how no one can read Bella's mind despite the fact that she is a human or the fact that Alice could see visions of the future, even when she was a human. Arthur thought quickly as his jaw clenched. I didn't think of that. Maybe because humans with gifts are so rare, or the fact that Bella's gift is more mental than physical. The reason doesn't matter. What matters is the fact that I'm in quite the situation. Where the hell are you, Alice? Protecting mate bullshit. Future vision my ass. Arthur thought to himself as he lowered his stance slightly. Then are you prepared to fight with me? Because you're not the first vampire I've fought, and neither would you be the first one I'd kill. Arthur spoke, his tone still completely calm as he lied through his teeth. His pupils focused on the man before him. Technically, I could kill a vampire if I had enough preparations, and if I set up a trap, however, right now. I'm powerless. Arthur thought inwardly with a sigh, hoping that the man would believe his bluff. For a moment, silence engulfed the rooftop. The only sound was the cars and people commuting below them, as well as the ruffle of their clothes from the wind. Finally, it was broken when the man shook his head. I'll let you go because it was clear you tracked me with the intention of finding another cold one. You're their responsibility, and I'd rather not fight someone else over this. The man spoke before his body turned into a blur. Arthur sidestepped to the left before he could even think. And there, right where his head had been, the man stood with his arm extended in a clawing motion. You're quite the liar, mister, Arthur said. His blunt tone had turned colder. My body moved as soon as he completed his words before he even attacked me. It was pure instinct. If not for that fact, I would have already been dead. Arthur thought, an emotion finally starting to enter his usually emotionless mind. Pure dread. Arthur didn't hesitate for even a single split second more as he jumped, not backward, but directly out of the rooftop. His hands quickly latched onto the brick wall as he continued doing small leaps until he fell onto the ground below. The thought hadn't occurred to him at the start. Had it been the stress of a vampire running towards him or something else, and so he had chosen to hide in an apartment. However, that wasn't the best choice. No, the best choice to hide from a vampire was to simply head into the area with as many people as possible. In this case, it would be a shopping mall or a plaza in the middle of the city. The vampire wouldn't be able to attack, or he would risk the humans seeing it. If it was an apartment with just a few humans, they could always just kill them all. However, if he killed 1,000 people in a plaza, that would do more bad than good. Not to mention all the security cameras around. It would be a nightmare. Of course, in a regular case, the vampire would simply wait until night or when the target left the populated area and then eliminate them. But in this case, Arthur had backing. All he had to do was wait until Alice and the Cullens arrived, and he would be safe, running down the street and making sure that there were always people around him. Arthur rushed back towards the plaza. His speed was close to superhuman levels, even faster than an Olympic runner. However, he didn't have to hide. It would surprise the onlookers. However, it still didn't look like something out of a movie. Simply surprising, not shocking. Looking left and right, Arthur went from street to street, always choosing the best lit-up streets and the ones with the most people in them. It took him around 4 minutes of constant running, his heart beating a mile a minute, goosebumps all over his body for him to finally arrive at the center plaza. Looking there, he saw her, the yellow Porsche and Alice, standing right next to it with a grim expression that quickly changed as soon as she saw him into one of pure relief. Thank God, you're safe. I couldn't see where you were. It was as if my gift suddenly started malfunctioning. Alice said quickly as she instantly engulfed him in a hug. Her voice had been calm, however her hands were clearly shaking. I'm fine, however the vampire is likely still following after me. Arthur replied swiftly as he continued looking around them at each alley and street, inspecting each passerby for the man's face. How did you end up with him chasing you? Alice asked as she broke off the hug, her voice serious as she herself started looking around. I have no idea. I managed to smell a possible vegetarian vampire that I thought was Edward. However, it turns out it was someone else, and the man seemed to instantly lock onto me the moment I started locating him. likely a supernatural gift of some sort similar to your future sight. Arthur replied, still tense, and for once, in actual emotional turmoil. He had never felt like this before. It was like his body was burning up. Back when he had lived alone in that half-broken house, hunting wildlife for survival. He had faced many predators and been in harrowing situations. However, his body had always been preserved, and his mind had always maintained absolute calm, even in the face of danger, as if knowing that he had never actually been in danger, that nothing normal could pose a harm to him, not even a bear. And yet now, when faced with this vampire, he felt like his body was telling him to run constantly, like it knew on pure instinct that it stood no chance against the man. Arthur's pupils dilated, his breath growing faster yet deeper at the same time, and his skin starting to slightly shine with sweat. He felt heated all over like a well-oiled machine, starting to work overtime. His perception changed. It was like time was starting to slow down before his eyes. The movements of each and every passerby around him starting to slow. He started seeing more details, like the flutter of wings from a butterfly tens of meters away, the direction of the wind, the heat, the way the leaves ruffled, and in which direction they did. His sense of hearing, smell, touch, and even taste were similarly elevated to the extreme. He felt like he could practically taste the air itself. Alice, who was next to him, quickly noticed the oddity. "Arthur, what's wrong? Are you all right?" she asked quickly, her voice tinged with slight fear and panic as she looked at her mate. "I'm fine. In fact, I don't think I've ever felt better," Arthur replied, his voice confused, not bland or emotionless, actually confused. He could hear his own heartbeat. It was going a mile a minute, and it felt so loud, even in the clamor of the plaza around them. His eyes finally locked onto a figure hidden by the shadow of two buildings in a small alley. It was looking directly at him and Alice. Those same amber, almost golden eyes were fixed onto Arthur. That same pale, almost chalky skin. "Over there." Arthur spoke quickly towards Alice as he kept the man in his sight, never once looking away, not even blinking as he stared at him. Another one that doesn't drink human blood? Then why is he after you?" Alice asked confusedly. However, her posture was already screaming that she was ready to fight at any second as she walked in front of Arthur. "Much more loyal to those Volturi guys. He knows that I know about them, and as a human, that's a death sentence to me. That's what the problem is." Arthur replied, his hands clenched. "You shouldn't have been able to notice me at all. You're human, yet you can hear me even from there, can sense me from hundreds of meters away. At this point, I'm starting to actually think that you can't even be classified as a human anymore. However, rules are rules." The man spoke in that deep baritone voice. Arthur usually wouldn't have been able to hear the man, especially not when he was so far away and speaking in such a low, deep voice. However, at this moment, he heard him clear as day, as if he was right in front of him. Alice released a hiss, her amber eyes turning completely black and feral as she stared at the man in pure rage. "Try it," she spoke, her voice sounding more animalistic than human. "How did it turn from us hunting Bella and Edward for this, to me getting hunted for the exact same reason almost?" Arthur thought to himself as he released a sigh, trying to gather himself. However, his body wasn't responding. No matter what he tried, he couldn't regain his calm. It was like he was burning up from the inside. The senses only kept getting more and more heightened. At this point, Arthur almost felt like he could sense the blood rushing inside his own veins. "What you're doing is against the rules of our kind. The Volturi won't take kindly to this. Are you sure that a mere human is worth your entire coven?" the man asked in that low baritone voice of his from the other side of the street. Alice simply growled as she replied in a deep feral voice, sounding utterly inhuman. "He is part of the coven. We simply haven't turned him yet." "I see. Well, then I shall report this to the Volturi. If he isn't turned by the time they come for the investigation, that's your problem," the man replied as he turned to walk away. However, Alice didn't wait. She didn't hesitate even for a single moment as she vanished in a blur of movement towards the alley and the vampire. Her arm raised in a clawing movement already as she appeared behind him almost instantly. Arthur could only watch. If previous he could see the vampiric movement only after it had happened, now he could react to it. He was still slower, Much slower, however, he could counterattack if he predicted a movement. He could see everything. Arthur himself didn't wait when he saw Alice. He ran backward towards the Porsche. He would only be a burden if he stayed here. His best choice at the moment was to get as far away as possible, back to the Cullen mansion, and hope that the rest of the Cullens would come to Alice or that she would simply win. He was close to the Porsche already. He slammed the door open, however, just as he was about to jump inside the car. His body was yanked backwards by the hem of his shirt at supernatural speeds, quickly being slammed towards the alley, almost dragged through mid-air. Looking back, he saw that the man had managed to dodge Alice and had swerved around her before grabbing him at the car. Arthur was slammed against an alley wall, the man's face close to his whilst his eyes were on Alice. "Stop, or I snap his neck." The man spoke, his voice cold as he gazed at Alice, who had frozen in place, her eyes now completely black voids as she looked at Arthur pinned to the alley wall and the man. Before Alice could do anything, the man spoke coldly. "I'll turn him. Either let me complete the process or I kill him now. The rules must be followed no matter what." Alice practically vibrated in rage, however, she held still. "All right, do you have enough control to manage that and not kill me?" Arthur questioned. His hands were trembling, however, he didn't put up any resistance. "Yes, I've maintained my control for over 300 years now." The man replied before opening his mouth and biting Arthur's neck without a single wasted second. Pain like no other shot through Arthur's body before it was suddenly gone. The man had wrenched his head back and was now coughing on the ground. His entire face was scrunched up in pain as his body started convulsing. "My blood? Is it?" Arthur instantly thought before a smile showed on his face for the first time in this life. Arthur felt pure joy. He felt giddy at the sight of the man convulsing. That lasted a single second before he froze and slowly turned his gaze towards Alice. "I'm bleeding. It's toxic, however, what if it still smells just as nice as human blood? She's already on the verge of losing control. She won't kill me, but she could kill herself if my blood is that toxic." Arthur thought quickly as he took a step back. "Alice, you still in control?" Arthur questioned, his tone wary. "Yes, I'm still here. It's a bit hard. If you could go back to the Porsche. I'll deal with him now," Alice replied, her voice strained. Similarly to how Jasper's was constantly, she clearly sounded like she was in pain at the close distance she had with Arthur and his blood. So it still is as enticing to them. I mean, Carlisle clearly didn't notice anything different about it from the smell alone, and we still didn't have the test from the hospital about its structure. Arthur thought as he gave a quick nod and instantly started running towards the Porsche. Alice, meanwhile, crouched down to the convulsing vampire and instantly started raining punches on his body. First, she shattered his ribs, next his left hand before doing the same to his right. After she shattered almost all of the bones in his face as well as his jaw, before moving to his legs and quickly doing the same before grabbing the now sack of what remained of the vampire and using her speed to quickly head to the end of the alley and throwing the man in a pile of trash. She disappeared for a moment in a blur of speed and came back quickly with a lighter in hand and a case of gasoline, quickly drenching the man in it before lighting him and the trash bags around him on fire. The body of the vampire quickly caught on fire, starting to burn at a higher speed than even the gasoline as his body started turning to ash, leaving nothing behind. Alice walked out of the alley, but didn't get close to the Porsche. "You have some money at the passenger side of the seat. Use that and go to a hotel at least for tonight. You smell too much of blood to come back home for now." Alice replied softly before vanishing in a blur once more, already heading back towards the Cullen mansion. They still had to deal with the Bella and Edward mess. Arthur finally felt his body start to cool down as he slumped on the driver's seat, releasing a soft sigh of relief. His emotions slowly starting to calm down, returning him to his usual emotionless state.
Hello, everyone. As we wrap up this video, I want to share a quick note. I have a Patreon account. If you'd like to support me and enjoy on-demand audiobooks, you can become a Patreon member. Alternatively, you can check out my Google Drive link, which has 500+ novel audiobooks available through my Ko-fi or Patreon shop. I appreciate your support.